A conqueror buried so secretly his own men were killed to keep the location silent. A kingdom that vanished from history, leaving only earthworks and unanswered questions about who built them and why. Skeletons across early medieval Europe, found without their heads, buried with care, not violence. These aren't isolated oddities. They're scattered across centuries and continents, yet they share something unsettling. The people who knew the truth made sure it died with them. Tonight, we open 20 of history's coldest cases, from Attila's hidden tomb to the silence of Cahokia. Let's begin. Somewhere beneath the plains of the Carpathian Basin, in soil that has been plowed, paved, and built upon for over 15 centuries, lies a grave that has never been found. No headstone marks it. No inscription names its occupant. And yet, according to the ancient sources, the man buried there once made emperors tremble. His name was Attila, ruler of the Huns, a man so feared by Rome that chroniclers called him Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. In 453 AD, after a lifetime of conquest that stretched from the Rhine to the Caspian, Attila died suddenly on his wedding night. The Roman historian Jordanes, drawing on the earlier account of Priscus, describes a hemorrhage, a violent nosebleed that, in his drunken sleep, choked him. A simple, almost anticlimactic end for a man who had reshaped the map of late antiquity through terror alone. What happened next is where the historical record becomes strange. According to Jordanes, Attila's body was placed inside 3 nested coffins, one of gold, one of silver, one of iron, symbolizing the wealth he had extracted from his enemies and the iron will with which he had taken it. He was buried at night, in secret, somewhere along a riverbed. And then, in an act that still unsettles historians today, the men who dug the grave and carried out the burial were killed immediately afterward, reportedly by Attila's own soldiers, to ensure that no one could ever reveal the location. If the account is accurate, it means an entire burial party was executed for the sole purpose of erasing a location from human memory. And if that's true, it worked. No tomb has ever been confirmed. No coffin of gold, silver, or iron has surfaced. For over 1,500 years, the resting place of one of history's most consequential rulers has simply not existed. At least, not anywhere we've been able to find it. The most widely accepted theory points to the region around modern Hungary, possibly near the Tisza River, where Attila is believed to have held court. Archaeologists have searched riverbeds, floodplains, and burial mounds across the area for over a century. Some have proposed that the grave may lie beneath a river that has since shifted course, meaning the tomb itself could be entombed not in soil, but in water, sealed by centuries of sediment. Others have looked further afield. Some historical traditions, particularly later Hungarian folklore, place the burial near Lake Balaton. Still others suggest the location may have been deliberately falsified in the historical sources themselves, a kind of misdirection meant to outlive Attila by centuries, ensuring that even if his story survived, his grave never would. Then there are the fringe theories, the kind that surface whenever a tomb refuses to be found. Treasure hunters have speculated about hidden chambers beneath Hungarian churches built centuries later, intentionally positioned over older, unmarked graves. Others wonder whether parts of the burial were salvaged and absorbed into later royal treasuries, the gold melted down and the truth melted with it. None of this is confirmed. None of it can be disproven either. What we're left with is a paradox. One of the most feared and well-documented rulers of the ancient world vanished completely the moment he was lowered into the ground. We know how he died. We know, more or less, how he was buried. We even know why no one was supposed to find him. So perhaps the real question isn't whether Attila's tomb still exists. It's whether it was ever meant to be found at all. The silence that follows Attila's vanished grave is not unique to him. A century after his death, another vault of unimaginable wealth disappeared from history just as completely. Not lost to time by accident, but, many believe, deliberately hidden by people who never returned to claim it. Picture a mountain pass in the Pyrenees, where mist settles low over jagged rock even in summer, and where local shepherds have, for generations, told stories of buried gold sealed beneath stone markers no one can quite locate. Or picture the dry hills outside Toulouse in southern France, once the capital of a kingdom that controlled, for a brief and glittering period, more wealth than almost any power in post-Roman Europe. This is the landscape associated with one of history's most persistent treasure legends, the lost hoard of the Visigoths. To understand why this treasure looms so large in legend, we have to go back to the year 410 AD, when the Visigothic king Alaric I did what no one had managed in 8 centuries. He breached the walls of Rome itself. The sack of the city was, by ancient standards, relatively restrained. Churches were spared, and Alaric reportedly ordered his men not to harm those who sought sanctuary. But restraint did not mean the Visigoths left empty-handed. They carried off treasure on a staggering scale, including, according to several historical traditions, a hoard that had itself already traveled a long and bloody road. Decades earlier, in 70 AD, Roman forces under Titus had sacked Jerusalem and looted the treasures of its temple. Golden vessels, ceremonial objects, and according to some accounts, the temple's great menorah itself. These spoils were paraded through Rome and depicted on the Arch of Titus, where you can still see soldiers carrying them in relief carving today. For over 3 centuries, this treasure reportedly sat in Roman vaults, until Alaric's sack of the city in 410 AD allegedly returned it to circulation, this time in Visigothic hands. From here, the trail grows colder and stranger. The Visigoths, after sacking Rome, moved west into Gaul and eventually into Hispania, establishing a kingdom that would last for centuries. Historical sources tell us that a portion of their plundered wealth, including, possibly, the temple treasures, was transported with them as they shifted their capital first to Toulouse and later into the Iberian Peninsula. Roman and later Byzantine chroniclers occasionally mention this treasure in passing, almost as a known fact requiring no elaboration, a sign that, at the time, its existence wasn't in question. The mystery isn't whether the treasure existed, it's what happened to it. In 507 AD, the Visigoths suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Voyage against the Frankish king Clovis III. King Alaric II was killed, and the Visigoths were pushed out of most of Gaul, retreating into Hispania. According to some accounts, in the chaos of this collapse, the royal treasure, by then a combination of decades of accumulated plunder, was hidden, possibly buried, somewhere along the retreat route to keep it from falling into Frankish hands. And then, historically speaking, it simply stops being mentioned. Did the Visigoths recover it later, quietly absorbing it back into their royal treasury in Toledo, where it would eventually be lost again during the Muslim conquest of Hispania in 711 AD? Some historians find this the most plausible explanation, not a single dramatic burial, but treasure that moved, fragmented, and was gradually absorbed and redistributed over centuries of war, the way most ancient wealth ultimately was. Wars are expensive. Gold gets spent, melted, reminted. The less sensational answer is often that there was no single hiding place at all, just slow, undocumented dispersal. But this explanation has never fully satisfied everyone, and that's where the more speculative threads begin. Local legends across southern France, particularly around the town of Rennes-le-Château, have long associated the region with buried Visigothic gold. Claims that gained renewed attention in the 20th century amid a wave of esoteric and occult interest in the area, much of it later shown to be fabricated or exaggerated for tourism and intrigue. Separately, and with considerably more historical grounding, some researchers have pointed to records suggesting that portions of the temple treasure specifically may have been moved multiple times, from Rome to Carthage under the Vandals after their own sack of the city in 455 AD, and from there possibly to Constantinople, where Byzantine sources mention temple vessels being returned toward Jerusalem under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. If true, this would mean the treasure's story didn't end with the Visigoths at all. It simply passed through their hands as one chapter in a much longer journey, which leaves us with competing, overlapping possibilities, none definitively proven, a treasure buried in the Pyrenees and never recovered. A treasure absorbed gradually into the Visigothic kingdom and lost piecemeal over 2 centuries of war. A treasure that left Visigothic hands entirely and continued its journey eastward, back toward the land it came from. Or some combination of all 3, fragments scattered across a continent in upheaval. No metal detector has confirmed a hoard. No vault has been opened. The shepherd's stories in the Pyrenees remain stories. What we have instead is a chain of historical sources, each one confirming the treasure's existence at a particular moment, and each one going quiet just before telling us where it went next. Perhaps that's the nature of wealth this old. It doesn't vanish all at once. It slips out of the record gradually, mentioned for the last time by someone who had no idea it was the last time at all. So the gold sits, if it sits anywhere, beneath 13 centuries of soil, war, and silence. And the question isn't only where it might be. It's whether anyone, even at the time, ever truly knew. If gold can vanish into the silence of history, so too, it seems, can people. And few disappearances are as quietly unsettling as the one that took place on a jagged spire of rock rising out of the Atlantic, 8 miles off the coast of Ireland. Skellig Michael does not look like a place built for human life. Its name means Michael's Rock, after the archangel believed to guard high, dangerous places, and the island earns that association. 2 steep peaks of sandstone and slate erupt nearly 230 meters out of the ocean, battered constantly by wind and salt spray, with almost no level ground anywhere on its surface. And yet, sometime around the 6th or 7th century AD, a small community of Christian monks chose this exact place, one of the most inhospitable scraps of land in Western Europe, to build a monastery. What they constructed there has survived, remarkably intact, for over 1,400 years. Climbing more than 600 stone steps carved directly into the cliff face, visitors today reach a cluster of beehive-shaped stone huts, called clochons, built without mortar, using a corbelling technique so precise that the structures remain watertight to this day. There's a small oratory, a graveyard, stone crosses, and terraced gardens where monks grew what little food the island's harsh soil allowed. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary surviving examples of early medieval monastic life anywhere in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a place that feels less built than grown out of the rock itself. For roughly 600 years, this tiny, self-sufficient community persisted. Monks lived in near-total isolation, devoted to prayer, manuscript copying, and an ascetic lifestyle so extreme that historians still debate how anyone survived there long-term, let alone for centuries. They fished. They collected rainwater in stone cisterns. They endured Viking raids. We know of at least 3 between the 9th and 10th centuries, one of which, according to the Annals of Ulster, resulted in the abbot being taken captive and reportedly dying of hunger and thirst while held by his captors. The monks rebuilt. They stayed. And then, sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, they left, and we don't fully know why. The mainstream explanation is, on its surface, simple enough: a shifting climate. Historians point to the onset of cooling conditions in the centuries following the medieval warm period, part of a broader pattern of climatic instability across the North Atlantic that made an already marginal existence on Skellig Michael untenable. Storms may have grown more frequent and severe. Fresh water, never abundant, may have become harder to secure. At some point, the monastic community is believed to have relocated to Ballinskellig's Abbey on the mainland, where life, while still austere, offered considerably more stability. It's a reasonable theory. It's also, frustratingly, almost entirely inferred rather than documented. There is no surviving record, no charter, no letter, no annal entry that explains the departure in the monk's own words. We don't know if it happened gradually, over a generation, or suddenly, in response to a single catastrophic event. We don't know if every monk left at once, or if the island was slowly abandoned as its population dwindled towards 0. The written history of Skellig Michael, rich as it is for certain centuries, goes almost completely silent at the exact moment we'd most want it to speak. This is where the questions start to multiply. Why, for instance, does archaeological evidence suggest the monastery may have been still in at least partial use even after the presumed relocation to Skelligs? As if the island was not so much abandoned as maintained alongside a second home, for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Why do later medieval pilgrimage records show people continuing to visit Skellig Michael for penitential rituals well after the monks themselves were gone, treating the island as sacred ground long after its residents had vanished from it? And why did a place so remote, so difficult to reach, hold such enduring spiritual significance in the first place? Significance that, if local folklore is to be believed, predates Christianity entirely, with some traditions associating the island with pre-Christian mythological figures and otherworldly crossings, long before any monk set foot there. The more speculative theories tend to gather around this idea of layered sacredness. The notion that Skellig Michael wasn't chosen by early Christian monks at random, but was already considered a liminal place, a threshold between the ordinary world and something else, and that the monastery was built atop that older significance, rather than instead of it. There's little hard evidence to support this directly. It rests mostly on comparative patterns seen at other early Christian sites across Ireland and Britain, where churches and monasteries were frequently established on locations already significant in pre-Christian tradition. Whether Skellig Michael fits that pattern, or whether its isolation was simply a practical spiritual choice by monks seeking maximum solitude, remains genuinely unresolved. What we're left with, in the end, is a monastery that survived raids, isolation, and centuries of brutal weather, only to empty out quietly, without explanation, at a moment history simply failed to record. No mass grave has been found suggesting catastrophe. No evidence of plague or violence marks the final years of occupation. The monks, as far as the archaeology can tell us, simply stopped being there. Did they leave gradually, carrying their manuscripts and their faith down 600 steps for the last time, glancing back at beehive huts they knew would outlast them by centuries? Or did something happen on that rock? Something sudden enough to leave no time for record-keeping, no final entry in any annal anywhere? The huts are still there. The steps are still there. The silence, it seems, is the only thing that was left behind. The silence on Skellig Michael is one kind of mystery, an absence where there should be a record. But across the soil of early medieval Europe, archaeologists have uncovered something far more physically unsettling. Not an absence of bodies, but bodies missing one very specific part. In a quiet field in Hampshire, England, excavators working a cemetery site uncovered something that initially looked like a standard early Anglo-Saxon burial, until they reached the skull. It wasn't where it should have been. Instead, it rested between the individual's legs, carefully placed, deliberately positioned. Nearby, in the same burial ground, lay another skeleton, headless in the same way, the skull set down near the feet with what excavators described as evident care rather than violence. These weren't isolated finds. Across England, Germany, Scandinavia, and parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have documented dozens of similar burials dating from roughly the 5th to the 10th century AD, a pattern widespread enough that it has earned its own name in archaeological literature. The prone and decapitated burial phenomenon, though decapitation alone, without the prone positioning, appears just as often. The first and most obvious question anyone asks is whether these were executions. And in some cases, the evidence does point that way. At sites like Walkington Wold in Yorkshire, archaeologists uncovered a cluster of burials where skulls had been separated from bodies with clear evidence of trauma. Cut marks consistent with execution by blade, the bodies buried without coffins or grave goods, often in unconsecrated ground slightly apart from the main cemetery. This fits a known historical pattern. Early medieval law codes, including those from Anglo-Saxon England, prescribed beheading for certain capital crimes, and execution cemeteries, separate from community burial grounds, have been identified at multiple sites across England specifically for this purpose. But here is where the pattern stops being simple. Not all of the headless burials show this signature of violence and exclusion. A significant number were found within normal cemetery boundaries, buried with the same care, the same grave goods, the same positioning conventions as their neighbors. Except for the skull, which had been removed, sometimes long after death, and placed deliberately elsewhere on the body. In some cases, the skull was positioned by the feet. In others, cradled in the arms. In a particularly striking burial uncovered in Anglo-Saxon England, the skull had been placed not just near the body, but turned to face it directly, as though arranged in deliberate, careful relation to the rest of the skeleton. A detail that doesn't fit comfortably into either a straightforward execution or an accidental disturbance. This is where archaeologists begin to diverge sharply in their interpretations. One mainstream theory holds that some of these decapitations occurred not at the moment of death, but afterward, during a secondary burial ritual, when a body that had already been interred elsewhere was exhumed, the head removed, and the remains reburied. This practice, sometimes linked to broader European traditions of deviant burial, may have served a protective function. A belief, found in various forms across early medieval folklore, that the dead, particularly those who died suddenly, violently, or under suspicious circumstances, might not stay dead. Removing or repositioning the head in this reading wasn't a punishment. It was a precaution, a way of ensuring that whatever animated a body in life couldn't easily reanimate it after death. This theory connects to a broader and better documented medieval European anxiety around what we'd now loosely call the restless dead. Corpses believed capable of rising, walking, or causing harm to the living. Later medieval sources from regions including Germany and Eastern Europe describe various methods used to prevent this. Weighing bodies down with stones, staking them in place, or, in some documented cases, removing the head entirely. Whether these later, better recorded beliefs extend backward to explain the earlier Anglo-Saxon and continental decapitation burials is something historians genuinely disagree on. The practices are similar, but separated by centuries, and a similarity in method doesn't necessarily prove a similarity in belief. Other researchers have proposed more socially grounded explanations. Some decapitated burials may represent individuals who died away from their community, soldiers, travelers, or victims of accidents, whose remains were only partially recovered, with the head arriving separately or not at all, leading to careful, ritualized reburial of whatever bones were available. Others have suggested that certain decapitations may reflect specific religious or social status, marking individuals who occupied an ambiguous position in their community, neither fully honored with a standard burial nor condemned to an execution cemetery, but treated with a kind of ritual caution somewhere in between. The more speculative end of the discussion leans into the idea that these burials reflect a genuine, widespread early medieval belief system around death and the body, one largely lost to us because so little of it was written down. Christianity was still spreading and consolidating across much of this region during these centuries, often layering over, rather than fully replacing, older beliefs about the dead. If this is true, the headless burials may represent one of the only physical traces we have left of an entire framework of belief that otherwise vanished without documentation, surviving only in the careful, deliberate way certain bodies were laid in the ground. What makes this mystery especially difficult to resolve is its sheer geographic and chronological spread. These aren't burials confined to a single culture, a single century, or a single explanation. Some clearly mark crime and punishment. Others appear to mark something closer to reverence, or fear, or both at once. And without written records from the communities who perform these burials, archaeologists are left reconstructing intention from bone position alone, interpreting silence through skeletons that can show us exactly what was done, but never quite tell us why. Somewhere in that gap between physical evidence and lost belief, the real answer is still buried. The question is whether it was ever meant to be understood by anyone outside the people who placed those skulls so carefully, all those centuries ago. If the headless burials of early medieval Europe leave us guessing at belief, The story of Eric the Red leaves us guessing at something simpler and somehow just as frustrating: a single specific grave that should be findable and isn't. The location in question is Brattahlid, a fjord-side settlement on the southwestern coast of Greenland, where green, sheltered valleys cut into an otherwise brutal landscape of ice and stone. It's a place that still feels improbable today. Fertile enough, in short bursts of summer, to support grazing animals and modest farming, surrounded by some of the most unforgiving terrain in the northern hemisphere. It was here, around 985 AD, that Eric the Red established the first permanent Norse settlement in Greenland, having been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter and sailed west in search of land he'd glimpsed years earlier, or so the sagas tell us. Eric the Red is, in many ways, one of the better documented figures of the Viking Age. He appears in two major Icelandic sagas, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, texts written down in the 13th century, 200 to 300 years after the events they describe, drawing on oral tradition that had been passed down across generations. According to these accounts, Eric lived out his final years at Brattahlid as a respected, if famously stubborn, leader of the Greenland colony. The sagas describe him remaining committed to the Old Norse pagan religion, even as his wife, Theodild, and much of the settlement converted to Christianity, reportedly building a small church at Brattahlid specifically so she wouldn't have to worship alongside her husband. He is believed to have died around 1003 AD, possibly during a disease outbreak that struck the settlement not long after a ship arrived from Norway, though the sagas are vague about the precise cause. And it's at this exact point, the moment of his death, that the historical trail goes cold. Here's what makes this disappearance different from many others in history. We know almost exactly where to look. Archaeologists identified the site of Brattahlid with a high degree of confidence in the early 20th century, based on saga descriptions matching the geography precisely. A fjord now known as Kasiarsuk, where Norse ruins, including the remains of Theodild's church and an associated small cemetery, have been excavated and confirmed. This is, by Viking Age standards, an extraordinarily well-documented site. We have the farm, we have the church, we have dozens of burials from the surrounding cemetery, some of which have been excavated and studied in detail. What we don't have is Eric. The mainstream explanation is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. As a committed pagan, Eric likely wasn't buried in his wife's Christian churchyard at all. Norse pagan burial practices in this period varied widely, but they often emphasized different locations, different rites, and sometimes different forms of marking the grave entirely. Practices that, unlike formal Christian cemeteries, don't always leave the same kind of consistent, identifiable archaeological footprint. If Eric was buried according to pagan custom somewhere on or near the farm at Brattahlid, his grave could be virtually anywhere in the surrounding landscape, unmarked by the kind of stone cross or churchyard boundary that has helped archaeologists locate so many of his Christian contemporaries. This explanation is reasonable, well supported by what we know of religious practice during this transitional period in Norse history, and almost certainly correct in broad strokes. And yet it leaves a strange gap at the center of an otherwise remarkably well-documented life. We can stand in the ruins of his daughter-in-law's church. We can walk the boundaries of his farm. We know, give or take a year, when he died. But the man who founded an entire Norse colony in one of the most hostile environments on Earth has no identified grave, in a location where dozens of his contemporaries do. This gap has invited more speculative readings. Some researchers have wondered whether Eric's pagan burial, precisely because it stood in quiet defiance of his own family's new faith, may have been deliberately unmarked or even concealed by a community eager to move past its pagan founder, as Christianity took firmer hold in Greenland over the following decades. Greenland's Norse settlements would, within a generation or two of Eric's death, be fully Christianized, with a bishopric eventually established at nearby Gardar. In a community actively reshaping its religious identity, a prominent ancestor's pagan grave may not have been something later generations were eager to preserve or commemorate. Others have raised a more environmental possibility. Greenland's coastline, and particularly the low-lying farmland around fjords like Brattahlid, has been subject to significant erosion and shifting land use over the past 1,000 years, including periods of glacial advance and retreat. It's entirely possible that an unmarked pagan grave near the coast was simply lost to natural processes long before anyone thought to look for it, swallowed by the same harsh landscape Eric spent his final years trying to tame. What remains, in the end, is one of Viking history's more quietly haunting gaps. A man whose voyage opened an entire chapter of Norse exploration, whose farm and family church still stand in ruin for visitors to walk through today, and who is, by every archaeological measure, simply absent from the ground that holds almost everyone else around him. Is he still out there, somewhere in the grass and stone beyond the churchyard wall, in a grave that was never meant to be Christian and was perhaps never meant to be found at all? Eric the Red's missing grave is a single absence in an otherwise well-mapped landscape. At Sutton Hoo, in the green farmland of Suffolk, England, the puzzle runs in the opposite direction. Not too little evidence, but bodies that shouldn't be there at all, buried among treasure that has rewritten our understanding of early England. The site itself is a quiet, unassuming stretch of pasture overlooking the River Deben, marked by a series of low, grass-covered mounds that, for centuries, locals simply walked past without much thought. That changed in 1939, when archaeologist Basil Brown, working for landowner Edith Pretty, began excavating the largest of these mounds and uncovered something almost unprecedented in British archaeology. The ghostly outline of an enormous ship, nearly 27 meters long, its wooden hull long since rotted away, but its shape perfectly preserved in the impression left in the sand. At its center lay a burial chamber containing one of the richest hoards of Anglo-Saxon treasure ever found. A ornate helmet, gold belt buckles, Byzantine silver, weapons, and coins, all dated to the early 7th century AD. Most historians now believe this was the grave of an East Anglian king, quite possibly Redwald, one of the most powerful rulers in England at the time. It remains to this day one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in British history, a burial so opulent it single-handedly transformed scholarly understanding of early Anglo-Saxon England as a far wealthier, more internationally connected society than previously assumed. And yet, surrounding this famous ship burial, archaeologists found something else entirely. Something that has received far less attention and offers far fewer answers. Scattered around the periphery of the main burial mounds, excavators uncovered a series of additional burials, distinct in almost every way from the ship grave at the center. These bodies showed no grave goods, no ceremonial positioning, no indication of wealth or status whatsoever. Some were buried in unusual, contorted positions, limbs bent unnaturally, bodies placed face down, others seemingly thrown rather than laid into the ground. Radiocarbon dating placed many of these burials later than the main ship grave, suggesting they were added to the site sometime in the 7th to 8th centuries, after the famous mound had already been built and was, presumably, a known and significant landmark. The mainstream interpretation is that these were execution burials, a grim but historically consistent practice. Early Anglo-Saxon England did use prominent existing landmarks, including older burial mounds, as sites for executing and burying criminals, a practice that conveniently combined punishment with a kind of symbolic warning, visible to anyone passing through the area. The positioning of several bodies, with evidence consistent with hanging and the chaotic, careless arrangement of limbs, fits this explanation reasonably well. Under this reading, the criminals buried at Sutton Hoo had no connection to the king in the ship grave at all. They were simply unfortunate enough to be executed centuries later at a site that happened to already be associated with death and authority. This explanation accounts for much of what was found, but not all of it. A handful of the surrounding burials don't fit the execution pattern cleanly. Some show no clear signs of trauma consistent with hanging or other forms of capital punishment common to the period. A few were buried with at least some care. Not with the wealth of the central ship grave, certainly, but with more attention than a discarded criminal might typically receive. and the sheer number of burials clustered specifically around this one mound, rather than distributed across other, less significant sites in the area, has led some archaeologists to ask whether all of these individuals can really be explained by the same single cause. This is where the more speculative theories begin to surface. Some researchers have wondered whether at least some of the surrounding burials represent retainers or servants connected to the original king, sacrificed or required to die alongside their ruler in keeping with practices documented, though rarely, in other early Germanic and Scandinavian burial traditions. Direct evidence for this kind of retainer sacrifice in Anglo-Saxon England specifically is extremely thin, and most archaeologists remain cautious about applying patterns from Norse or continental sources directly onto Sutton Hoo. But the question persists, in part because the alternative explanation, while plausible, doesn't fully account for every burial at the site. Others have proposed that the choice to execute criminals specifically at Sutton Hoo, generations after the original ship burial, wasn't incidental at all. That the Mound's known association with a powerful, possibly still remembered pagan king made it a deliberately chosen site for punishment, a place where the authority of the old dead could be symbolically invoked against the condemned. If true, this would mean the later burials weren't simply convenient additions to an existing landmark, but a calculated use of the original king's memory and lingering reputation, decades or even a century after his death. What we're ultimately left with at Sutton Hoo is two stories occupying the same patch of land, separated by uncertain stretches of time and very little written explanation for either. One story is rich, documented in treasure, and tied with reasonable confidence to a known historical figure. The other is poorer, stranger, and resistant to a single clean explanation. Bodies placed around a king's grave for reasons that may have included justice, memory, ritual, or some combination none of us can fully reconstruct from bone and soil alone. The ship and its treasure have told us almost everything we could hope to know about who lay at the center of that mound. The bodies surrounding it have told us considerably less. And perhaps that imbalance is the real mystery. Not what was buried with honor at Sutton Hoo, but what and who was buried around it in silence. The questions left unanswered at Sutton Hoo belong to a single mound, a single generation. But just a few miles inland, and a few centuries earlier, a much larger disappearance was already underway. Not of individuals, but of an entire way of life, vanishing from the historical record almost as completely as if it had never existed at all. Picture the ruins of a Roman villa in the English countryside. At a site like Chedworth in Gloucestershire, where mosaic floors, Hippocaust heating systems, and bathhouses once supported a comfortable, distinctly Roman lifestyle, complete with imported pottery, wine, and the administrative trappings of empire. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been a functioning province of Rome, taxed, garrisoned, governed by Roman law, connected by Roman roads to a vast Mediterranean world. And then, within the span of a single generation around 410 AD, it wasn't. The bare historical facts are deceptively simple. Roman military forces, increasingly needed to defend the crumbling heart of the empire itself, were progressively withdrawn from Britain through the late 4th and early 5th centuries. In 410 AD, the Roman Emperor Honorius reportedly sent a letter to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defenses, a moment often cited as the symbolic end of Roman rule on the island. Administrative structures that had governed Britain for generations simply stopped functioning. Coinage stopped being minted and, within a few decades, largely stopped circulating. Long-distance trade networks that had supplied British villas with Mediterranean goods collapsed. Towns that had thrived under Roman administration began to empty out. What's genuinely strange isn't that Rome left. Empires contract. It's how completely and how quickly everything Roman about Britain seems to have unraveled afterward. And what happened to the hundreds of thousands of Romanized Britons who were, by this point, several centuries removed from any meaningful Celtic tribal identity, who spoke Latin in addition to British Celtic languages, who worshipped in Christian churches built in Roman style, who lived in towns with Roman names, under Roman law? Archaeologically, the evidence for what happened to this population in the decades immediately following 410 AD is remarkably thin. Roman towns across Britain show clear signs of decline, but not in most cases clear signs of violent destruction or mass death. Many simply seem to have been gradually abandoned or scaled back, their populations apparently dispersing rather than dying. Villas like Chedworth show evidence of continued, if diminished, occupation for some years after the formal end of Roman administration, before eventually being abandoned as well. The infrastructure of Roman life, sewage systems, heated floors, organized markets, required skilled maintenance and centralized administration that, once Roman governance disappeared, nobody seems to have stepped in to provide. The mainstream historical narrative holds that this Romano-British population didn't vanish so much as gradually transform and eventually be absorbed or displaced, amid roughly 2 centuries of significant upheaval. Independent British kingdoms emerged in the power vacuum left by Rome's departure, some led by figures whose names survive only in fragmentary, semi-legendary sources. At the same time, Anglo-Saxon migration and settlement from continental Europe began in earnest during the 5th century, gradually expanding across what would become England. Traditional accounts, including those written centuries later by figures like the monk Gildas, describe this as a violent, traumatic process. Romano-British communities pushed westward into Wales and Cornwall, or north or across the sea into Brittany, displaced by incoming Anglo-Saxon settlers in a series of conflicts that would eventually crystallize, centuries later, into the legendary stories surrounding King Arthur. This is where the historical picture becomes genuinely contested, and where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Modern archaeological and genetic research has complicated the older narrative of violent, wholesale displacement. DNA studies of early medieval British remains suggest a more complex and gradual process of population change than the dramatic invasion and expulsion narrative described by Gildas, with evidence pointing towards significant intermarriage and cultural blending between Romano-British populations and incoming Anglo-Saxon groups in many regions, alongside genuine displacement and conflict in others. The truth, in other words, appears to vary considerably by region and by century, resisting any single, clean explanation for what happened to Roman Britain's population as a whole. But even accounting for this complexity, certain specific gaps remain stubbornly unexplained. What happened, for instance, to the Romanized urban elite specifically? The administrators, merchants, and Christian clergy who had run Roman Britain's towns and villas, whose entire way of life depended on infrastructure and trade networks that disappeared almost overnight. Did they die out, unable to adapt to a world without empire? Did they flee en masse to Brittany, as some traditions suggest, in numbers significant enough to leave behind British place names still found in that region of France today? Or did many of them simply blend, quietly and without much trace, into the new political structures emerging around them, their Roman identity fading not through death or expulsion but through gradual cultural absorption over 2 or 3 generations? The written sources from this period are notoriously sparse and unreliable, written decades or centuries after the events they describe, often serving moral or political purposes that color their account of what really happened. Archaeology, meanwhile, can show us abandonment and decline with reasonable clarity, but struggles to tell us whether the people who once lived in a now empty villa died there, moved on peacefully, or were driven out by force. What we're left with, ultimately, is one of history's quieter disappearances. Not a single dramatic event, but an entire civilization's worth of people who, over the course of a few generations, simply stopped being identifiably Roman, their language, their religion, their administrative systems, and in many cases, their very communities dissolving into something else entirely. Did the last Romans of Britain die out, slowly and unrecorded? Did they flee to corners of the map where their descendants still, in some attenuated form, remain? Or are their descendants simply us, absorbed so completely into what came after that the question of where they went was, in the end, the wrong question to ask at all? The disappearance of Roman Britain unfolded slowly, region by region, family by family, fading into the medieval world that replaced it. Far to the south, in the highlands of East Africa, an entire empire underwent a disappearance just as profound. but considerably more abrupt and considerably less explained. The location is the city of Aksum, in what is now northern Ethiopia, where enormous carved stone monoliths called stelae still rise from the ground, some reaching over 24 meters in height, carved from single pieces of granite with a precision that remains genuinely difficult to explain given the tools believed available at the time. These towering monuments mark the burial sites of Aksumite royalty, and they are among the largest single stone structures ever erected anywhere in the ancient world, taller, in some cases, than many of the obelisks of Egypt. For roughly 7 centuries, the kingdom of Aksum stood as one of the great powers of the ancient and early medieval world. At its height, between the 1st and 7th centuries AD, Aksum controlled trade routes connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and as far as India, growing wealthy on exports of ivory, gold, and exotic goods. It minted its own coinage in gold, silver, and bronze, a level of economic sophistication shared by very few states anywhere in the world at the time. In the 4th century AD, under King Azana, Aksum became one of the earliest nations in the world to officially adopt Christianity, predating the conversion of the Roman Empire itself by several years. The 4th century Persian prophet Mani reportedly listed Aksum alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 great powers of his world. And then, beginning sometime around the 7th century AD, this powerful, wealthy, internationally connected kingdom essentially disappears from the historical stage, declining so thoroughly that for centuries afterward, European scholars debated whether ancient accounts of a great Christian African empire had been exaggerated or invented entirely. The mainstream historical explanation involves a convergence of factors. The rise of Islam in the 7th century fundamentally reshaped trade across the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula, regions Aksum had depended on heavily for its commercial wealth. As Islamic powers came to dominate these trade networks, Aksum found itself increasingly cut off from the international markets that had sustained its economy for centuries. Some historians also point to environmental factors. Soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive agriculture supporting a large urban population, combined with climate shifts that may have reduced rainfall in the region, potentially undermining the agricultural base needed to sustain Aksum's cities. This explanation accounts for decline. It accounts less well for the speed and completeness of what followed. Within a relatively short span, Aksum's great coastal trade dried up, its population is believed to have contracted significantly, and the political center of gravity in the region shifted inland and southward, eventually giving rise to new Ethiopian dynasties centered elsewhere. The city of Aksum itself didn't vanish entirely. It remained, and remains today, significant in Ethiopian Christian tradition. But the empire that once rivaled Rome and Persia in international prestige contracted into something far smaller and more regional, its broader history fading from outside knowledge so thoroughly that later visitors sometimes struggled to reconcile the modest town they found with the legendary empire described in older sources. Adding to the mystery is what Aksum is believed by Ethiopian Orthodox Christian tradition to still contain. According to long-standing Ethiopian religious tradition, the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum houses the Ark of the Covenant. The biblical container said to hold the tablets of the 10 Commandments, believed in this tradition to have been brought to Aksum from ancient Jerusalem by Menelik the Fëanor, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, according to the Ethiopian national epic known as the Kebra Nagast. A single guardian monk is said to watch over the relic continuously, and no one else is permitted to view it. A tradition maintained, according to the Church, without interruption for centuries. Mainstream historians and archaeologists generally treat this tradition as exactly that, a powerful and culturally significant religious belief, rather than a historically verifiable claim, given the absence of independent archaeological or documentary evidence confirming the object's presence or authenticity. But the tradition itself is neither new nor isolated. It forms a deep and consistent thread throughout Ethiopian religious and national identity stretching back many centuries, reinforced by Aksum's well-documented early adoption of Christianity and its real historical connections to trade routes touching the wider biblical world. Whether any relic genuinely rests within that guarded church and what it might actually be if so, remains entirely unverified. And, by the church's own tradition, unverifiable, since no outside examination has ever been permitted. What makes Aksum's story so unusual, set against the other disappearances explored so far, is this combination. A kingdom whose decline is reasonably well explained by documented economic and environmental pressures, standing alongside an enduring, deeply held tradition that its capital may still hold one of history's most significant religious objects, hidden in plain sight for over 1,000 years, protected not by archaeology or secrecy in any conventional sense, but by unbroken religious devotion. The stelae still stand in Aksum today, weathered but largely intact, monuments to a kingdom whose international stature was once beyond question and whose later centuries remain only partially understood. The guarded church still stands as well, its doors closed to outside verification by design rather than accident. Did Aksum's empire fall simply to the shifting tides of trade and climate, fading the way so many ancient powers eventually do? Or does some part of its extraordinary story remain exactly where tradition says it does, sealed away, unexamined, and never meant to be confirmed at all? The closed doors of Aksum's church protect a relic never meant to be examined. In northern Spain, in the rugged mountain kingdom that rose from the ashes of Visigothic Hispania, a different set of treasures vanished. Not through pious secrecy, but through theft so brazen and so recent that part of this mystery belongs not to the deep past, but to the 20th century. The kingdom of Asturias emerged in 718 AD, born from catastrophe. Just a few years earlier, in 711 AD, Umayyad forces had crossed from North Africa and shattered the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Hispania for nearly 3 centuries, defeating and killing King Roderick and collapsing Visigothic authority across most of the peninsula within a remarkably short span. Into the mountainous, defensible terrain of northern Spain fled a scattering of Visigothic nobility, clergy, and soldiers, where, according to tradition, a nobleman named Pelayo rallied local resistance and won a decisive victory at the Battle of Covadonga, founding what would become the Kingdom of Asturias, the first Christian kingdom to emerge in the Iberian Peninsula following the Umayyad conquest, and the symbolic beginning of what Spanish historical tradition would later call the Reconquista. As the last meaningful continuation of Visigothic political and religious authority, Asturias inherited more than just a claim to legitimacy. It inherited, or was believed to inherit, fragments of Visigothic royal and ecclesiastical treasure, sacred objects, ceremonial crowns, and votive offerings that Visigothic kings and bishops had been accumulating for generations before the kingdom's collapse. This is where Asturias connects to one of the most genuinely documented and genuinely unresolved treasure mysteries in Spanish history: the treasure of Guarazar. In 1858, near Toledo, the former Visigothic capital, a remarkable hoard was accidentally uncovered by 2 local laborers digging in an orchard. Buried beneath the soil was a collection of Visigothic votive crowns, golden objects donated by 7th century kings as offerings to the church, never meant to be worn, but suspended above altars as expressions of royal piety. The most spectacular piece, the crown of Recaswinth, is inlaid with sapphires and hung with pendant letters spelling out the king's name, dedicating the crown to God. Historical and archaeological evidence strongly suggests this treasure was hastily buried by Visigothic clergy in the chaotic years immediately following the Umayyad conquest of 711 AD, an attempt to hide sacred royal treasure from a conquering force, with the expectation, presumably, that someone would return to retrieve it. No one ever did. The treasure sat undisturbed for over 11 centuries. When it was finally found in 1858, the discovery caused a sensation, and ownership disputes followed almost immediately, with portions of the treasure being sold, smuggled, and fought over by collectors, the Spanish crown, and the French government before most of the surviving pieces were eventually divided between Spain's Royal Armory and the Cluny Museum in Paris. But even this resolution wasn't the end of the story. And this is where the mystery becomes considerably stranger and considerably more recent than most of the disappearances explored elsewhere in this series. In 1921, several pieces from the Guarazar treasure on display in Madrid were stolen outright. According to the most widely accepted historical account, the thieves, apparently unable to sell such recognizable and well-documented royal artifacts intact, melted several of the golden pieces down for their raw material value, destroying irreplaceable 7th century craftsmanship simply to liquidate the gold. Some pieces were reportedly recovered afterward, others were not, and remain unaccounted for to this day, their exact fate genuinely unknown rather than merely undocumented. Unlike treasures lost to the fog of early medieval record-keeping, this loss happened within living memory of people whose grandchildren are alive today. And we still don't know precisely what was destroyed, what may have survived in private hands, or whether any melted fragments might theoretically still exist, unrecognizable, somewhere in circulation. This connects back to Asturias in a more speculative but historically plausible way, because the Kingdom of Asturias positioned itself explicitly as the continuation of Visigothic royal authority. Some historians have proposed that additional Visigothic treasures, beyond what was eventually found at Guarazar, may have made their way north with fleeing nobility and clergy in 711 AD, potentially finding their way into early Asturian royal or ecclesiastical hands. Asturian monarchs, after all, needed exactly this kind of legitimizing material culture: crowns, relics, and sacred objects that visibly connected their fledgling mountain kingdom to the fallen grandeur of Visigothic Hispania. Some Asturian royal treasures are documented in later medieval church inventories from the region, including reliquaries and crosses associated with early Asturian kings, such as Alfonso II and Alfonso III, several of which survive today in the Camara Santa of Oviedo Cathedral. But whether additional undocumented pieces, crowns, or treasures comparable to those buried at Guarazar ever existed within Asturias, and what became of them if so, remains an open question, resting on inference rather than direct evidence. What we're left with, then, is a layered mystery spanning 12 centuries. A buried Visigothic treasure that waited over 1,000 years to be found, a kingdom in the Asturian mountains that may have inherited treasures from that same shattered Visigothic world, and a 20th century theft that proved, with uncomfortable clarity, that even treasures successfully recovered from one disappearance are never permanently safe from another. Somewhere between the orchard at Guarazar, the church treasuries of early Asturias, and a Madrid theft barely a century old, pieces of Visigothic royal heritage remain unaccounted for, not buried by time alone, but in at least one case, deliberately destroyed by hands that knew exactly what they were melting down. What, if anything, escaped that fate? And if it did, where, even now, might it still be sitting, unrecognized, unclaimed, and quietly waiting? The theft at Guarazar proved that even recovered treasures can disappear twice. Further north, across the sea separating Ireland from western Scotland, an entire kingdom's royal regalia presents a stranger problem still: relics whose authenticity and whereabouts have been disputed for over 7 centuries, with no resolution in sight. The kingdom in question is Riata, a Gaelic maritime realm that, from roughly the 6th to the 9th century AD, straddled the North Channel, encompassing parts of what is now Argyll in western Scotland and the northeastern coast of Ireland. Its political and ceremonial heart was Dunod, a dramatic rocky hill fort rising abruptly from the flat marshland of the Kilmartin Glen, accessible even today by a steep climb to its summit. Carved directly into the bedrock at the top of Dunod is a series of remarkable features: a basin, an outline of a boar, and most strikingly, the imprint of a single human footprint, worn into solid rock, believed by most archaeologists and historians to have served as part of an inauguration ritual for Riata's kings, who would place their foot into the carved print as part of the ceremony confirming their authority to rule. Riata mattered far beyond its own borders. Many historians consider it the political and cultural bridge through which Gaelic language, culture, and crucially, the institution of kingship itself, spread from Ireland into what would eventually become Scotland. Kenneth MacAlpin, traditionally credited as the founder of a unified kingdom of Scotland in the 9th century, is widely believed to have descended from Dalriata's royal line, making this small sea-facing kingdom an ancestral root of the entire later Scottish monarchy. And this is where the mystery of its relics begins, because Dalriata's royal legacy is bound up with one of the most famous and most genuinely disputed ceremonial objects in British history, the Stone of Destiny, also known as the Stone of Scone. According to long-established tradition, the Stone of Destiny was the very stone upon which the kings of Dalriata, and later the unified kings of Scotland, were crowned. A block of sandstone weighing roughly 150 kilograms, transported, according to legend, from Ireland to Dunad, and eventually to the Scottish royal site of Scone, where Scottish monarchs continued to be crowned upon it for centuries. In 1296, English forces under Edward I seized the stone from Scone and carried it to Westminster Abbey, where it was incorporated into the English and later British coronation throne, a calculated act meant to symbolically subjugate Scottish sovereignty by physically possessing the object upon which that sovereignty had traditionally been confirmed. This much is documented, political history rather than legend. What's genuinely disputed is whether the stone Edward I actually seized was the real one at all. A persistent tradition, dating back centuries in Scottish folklore, and given renewed attention by various historians and writers over the years, holds that the monks of Scone Abbey, anticipating Edward's invasion, hid the true Stone of Destiny and presented the English king with a substitute, possibly a plain piece of sandstone used as a cesspit cover or builder's stone, deliberately disguised to deceive the invading force while the genuine royal relic was concealed elsewhere, potentially buried somewhere in the vicinity of Scone, or hidden on the holy island of Iona, long associated with Dalriata's royal and religious authority. Mainstream historians remain skeptical of this substitution theory, generally treating the stone now associated with Scottish and British coronations, which was returned to Scotland in 1996 and is now displayed in Edinburgh Castle as the authentic historical object, despite its plain and somewhat unremarkable appearance for an item of such legendary significance. The stone's geological composition has been analyzed and matches sandstone found in the Scone area, lending credibility to its authenticity. But the legend has never fully died, in part because of a detail that's difficult to dismiss outright. Medieval descriptions of the original Stone of Destiny, including some chronicled accounts, describe a far more ornately carved object than the comparatively plain stone now on public display. A discrepancy that substitution theorists point to as evidence, and that mainstream historians generally attribute to embellishment in later, more romanticized retellings. Layered into this uncertainty is Dalriata's deeper, less publicly known relic tradition. Early medieval Irish and Scottish sources reference other royal and ecclesiastical objects associated with Dalriata's kingship and its close ties to early Christian monasticism, including relics connected to Iona's monastery, founded by Saint Columba in 563 AD, who himself maintained close relationships with Dalriata's royal line and reportedly played a direct role in the inauguration of at least one of its kings. Many of these smaller relics, unlike the famous stone, were never the subject of major recorded seizures or thefts. They simply stop appearing in historical sources after the Viking raids that devastated Iona and the wider region beginning in the late 8th century. Their fate folded into the same general disruption that eventually saw Dalriata itself absorbed into the broader kingdom of Alba. What remains, centuries later, is a peculiar layered uncertainty. A footprint carved in stone at Dunad, confirming that real inauguration rituals took place there, even as the most famous object associated with that royal tradition continues to carry whispered doubts about its own authenticity, debated by scholars and storytellers alike without final resolution. If the substitution legend holds even a grain of truth, then the actual Stone of Destiny, the one Dalriata's kings may have stood beside at their inauguration, the one Kenneth MacAlpin's ancestors may have known, was never seized by Edward IV at all, and remains to this day hidden somewhere within a landscape that has kept Dalriata's deepest secrets for over 1,000 years. The footprint at Dunad marks a ritual we understand, attached to an object we may not. Across the Atlantic, on a windswept stretch of Newfoundland coastline, a different kind of gap exists. Not between an object and its authenticity, but between an event we know happened and a written account of it that may have been lost, forged, or perhaps never properly recorded in the first place. The physical evidence begins at L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, where in 1960, Norwegian explorer and writer Helge Ingstad, working with his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad, identified the remains of a Norse settlement. Sod-walled buildings, a smithy, and artifacts including a bronze cloakpin, a bone needle, and ship repair tools, all dated through radiocarbon analysis to around 1000 AD. This was, and remains, the only confirmed Norse site in North America outside Greenland, definitive physical proof that Vikings reached the shores of the continent nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. In 2021, researchers refined this dating using a new technique analyzing solar radiation events preserved in the wood itself, pinpointing construction to the precise year 1021 AD, giving us, remarkably, an exact date for a Norse presence in North America, even as so much else about that presence remains maddeningly uncertain. We know they came. What we don't fully know is how the story was told, and whether the version that survives is the whole story at all. The Norse sagas that describe this voyage, primarily the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, the same texts that describe Eric the Red's own life and disputed grave, were written down in Iceland in the 13th century, 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. They tell of Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailing west from Greenland and discovering a new land he named Vinland, meaning either wine land, for wild grapes reportedly found there, or possibly pasture land, depending on how a particular Old Norse vowel is interpreted, itself a small but persistent scholarly dispute. The sagas describe subsequent expeditions, including one led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, who attempted to establish a permanent settlement, bringing livestock and, according to the saga, his pregnant wife Gudrid, who gave birth to a son named Snorri, possibly the first child of European descent born in North America, if the account is accurate. These sagas also describe conflict with indigenous peoples the Norse called Skrælings, encounters that began with trade and ended, according to the texts, in violence severe enough that the Norse ultimately abandoned their attempt at permanent settlement and returned to Greenland. Here's the genuine mystery underlying all of this. The two surviving sagas don't agree with each other. They diverge on names, on the sequence of voyages, on key details of who did what and when. Historians generally believe both texts drew on a shared earlier oral tradition, stories passed down through generations before finally being committed to writing in the 13th century, by which point inconsistencies, embellishments, and gaps had inevitably crept in. This raises a question that has occupied saga scholars for over a century. Was there ever a single, more complete, more contemporary account of the Vinland voyages, written closer to the actual events, that has simply been lost? Medieval Iceland produced an enormous body of written material relative to its tiny population, and historians know that not everything written survived. Manuscripts were lost to fire, decay, and simple neglect across the centuries between composition and the modern preservation of Icelandic literary heritage. If an earlier, more unified account of Vinland once existed, it would help explain why the two surviving sagas feel less like two independent records and more like two imperfect echoes of something larger that we no longer have access to. This gap in the written record becomes considerably more fraught when placed alongside one of the most notorious controversies in the history of cartography, the Vinland map. In 1965, Yale University announced the existence of a medieval map, allegedly dating to around 1440 AD, which appeared to depict a landmass labeled Nalanda Insula to the west of Greenland, apparently the earliest known map to show any part of North America, predating Columbus's voyage by over 50 years. The map's announcement caused an international sensation, suggesting it might represent a written, cartographic continuation of Norse knowledge about Vinland that had somehow survived independently of the sagas, carried forward through 15th century European map-making traditions that scholars hadn't previously known existed. The map was controversial from the start, and that controversy has only deepened with time. Multiple rounds of scientific testing across subsequent decades repeatedly raised concerns about the ink's chemical composition, with several studies finding traces of titanium dioxide in a form not commercially produced until the 1920s. Strong evidence, according to most researchers who have examined it, that the map is a modern forgery. In 2021, Yale itself formally concluded, following advanced spectral imaging analysis, that the map was very likely a 20th century fake, created using genuinely old parchment paired with a deliberately constructed text and image designed to deceive. If the Vinland map is indeed fraudulent, as the current scholarly consensus holds, it represents a strange inversion of the broader mystery. Not a lost authentic record waiting to be found, but a fabricated one, created specifically to fill the very gap that genuine historians have long wished could be filled. Someone, at some point in the 20th century, understood precisely what was missing from our knowledge of Vinland, and apparently decided to manufacture it rather than wait for it to be discovered. This leaves the actual historical record in a strange position. We have unimpeachable physical evidence, in the form of Lonso Meadows, that Norse explorers reached North America and lived there, however briefly, with a precision down to the very year that even most ancient historical events can't match. We have two saga accounts, written centuries later, that disagree with each other in ways suggesting a more complete original account may once have existed and been lost. And we have a sophisticated, scientifically unmasked forgery, created by someone willing to commit considerable expertise and resources toward inventing the very document that genuine scholarship has spent over a century hoping to find. Somewhere between an oral tradition first told around Greenlandic hearths 1,000 years ago and the imperfect, divergent sagas eventually written down centuries later, sits whatever the original, fuller story of Vinland actually was. Assuming it was ever written down at all, rather than simply passed mouth to mouth until enough details blurred or vanished that no single complete account ever existed in the first place. Was there once a more complete chronicle, lost to fire or neglect in some Icelandic farmhouse centuries ago? Or is the fragmented, contradictory record we have now the only one that ever truly existed, leaving us to wonder whether the real mystery isn't a lost document at all, but the limits of memory itself, stretched across 2.5 centuries before anyone thought to write it down? The forgeries and fragments surrounding Vinland remind us how easily history can be manufactured to fill a gap. In Denmark, the death of one of the Viking Age's most consequential kings presents nearly the opposite problem. An event that's well documented in its broad strokes, yet whose precise circumstances and whose final resting place remain unresolved even now. The starting point is a pair of massive carved stones standing in the small Danish town of Jelling, monuments so significant they've been called Denmark's birth certificate. The larger of the two, raised around 965 AD, bears a runic inscription commissioned by King Harald Bluetooth, declaring that he won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. It's one of the earliest written references to Denmark as a unified political entity anywhere in the historical record, and it sits beside an image of Christ, among the oldest such depictions in Scandinavia, carved at the exact moment Harald was steering his kingdom away from its pagan past. Harald Bluetooth, whose nickname would centuries later inspire the name of the wireless technology used in billions of devices worldwide, ruled Denmark for roughly 3 decades during the 10th century. A period in which he consolidated royal power, formally Christianized his kingdom, and undertook an extraordinary building program of fortified circular strongholds across Denmark, sites like Trelleborg and Firkat, engineered with such precise geometric symmetry that they still impress military historians and archaeologists today. He was, by most measures, one of the most successful and transformative rulers of the entire Viking Age. His death, however, is where the documented certainty starts to fray. According to the most widely cited account, found in the Chronicle of the medieval historian Adam of Bremen, writing roughly a century after the events described, Harald's later reign was upended by rebellion led by his own son, Swine Forkbeard. The exact cause of the rebellion is itself debated. Some sources suggest growing resentment over Harald's Christianization policies among segments of the population still attached to the old pagan religion, while others point to more conventional dynastic power struggles common throughout medieval succession crises. What the sources agree on is the outcome. Harald was wounded in battle against his son's forces, fled Denmark, and died in exile around 985 or 986 AD in a location that itself remains disputed, with various accounts placing his death in the Slavic lands south of the Baltic, possibly among the Wends, a Slavic people with whom Denmark had long-standing and complicated relations. This is, on its surface, a fairly standard medieval succession story. A king toppled by his own heir, dying in exile rather than at home. But the details around both his death and his burial resist the kind of clean resolution we'd expect for a ruler this significant, this well documented in other respects. Adam of Bremen's Chronicle states that Harald's body was eventually returned to Denmark and buried at Roskilde, in a church Harald himself had built. This account has been broadly accepted for centuries, and Roskilde Cathedral, which replaced the earlier church on the site, is treated today as the traditional, most historically credible location of Harald's grave, despite the fact that no individual tomb conclusively identified as his has ever been located within the cathedral. Extensive archaeological investigation of the site has uncovered evidence of earlier medieval burials beneath the current cathedral structure, consistent with Adam of Bremen's account, but nothing has surfaced bearing the kind of definitive identification. An inscription, a uniquely royal grave good, anything that would let historians say with confidence, "This is Harald." The uncertainty deepens further when we look beyond Roskilde. In the 1980s, archaeological excavations beneath the church at Jelling itself uncovered a large burial chamber, dated to the Right General period, containing grave goods of clearly high status, alongside human remains. For a time, this discovery raised the possibility that Harald might actually have been buried at Jelling, the site of his father's monuments and his own great royal inscription, rather than at Roskilde as Adam of Bremen's account suggests. Subsequent analysis complicated this picture, rather than resolving it. While the burial chamber clearly belonged to someone of very high status from the correct era, the skeletal remains recovered showed signs suggesting the body may have been moved and reburied at some point, and questions remain about whether this could represent Harald's father, Gorm the Old, rather than Harald himself, or possibly neither. More recently, the mystery has gained an entirely new layer. In 2014, Danish researcher Anne Petersen proposed, based on landscape and archaeological analysis, that an enormous, previously unexplained earthwork near the Polish village of Wiekowo, a site associated historically with the Slavic Wends, the very people among whom Harald reportedly died, might represent his actual original burial mound, constructed in the territory where he died before any later return of his remains to Denmark could have taken place. This theory remains speculative and isn't broadly accepted within mainstream Scandinavian archaeology, but it hasn't been definitively ruled out either, and the site continues to draw scholarly interest precisely because of how well it fits the geographic details of Harald's documented exile and death. What we're left with, then, is a king whose life is unusually well documented for the Viking Age. His reign, his monuments, his conversion of an entire kingdom to Christianity, even the broad outline of his final rebellion and exile, standing in stark contrast to a death and burial that remain genuinely contested across 3 separate possible locations, each with partial evidence and none with full confirmation. Roskilde has tradition and a chronicler's direct claim. Jelling has a burial chamber of the right status and the right era, undermined by ambiguous remains. Wiekowo has geographic and historical plausibility, undermined by a near-total absence of confirmed archaeological connection to Harald specifically. For a man whose name now lives on in the wireless signals connecting devices across the modern world, uniting them the way he once united Denmark, it's a strange irony that his own physical remains have never been definitively located or united with a confirmed identity at all. Did Harald Bluetooth come home to Roskilde exactly as Adam of Bremen claimed a century after the fact? Does he still rest beneath Yelling, beside the monuments that first declared Denmark a unified Christian kingdom? Or did he never leave the foreign soil where he died at all, buried among the very people whose territory may have sheltered him in his final, defeated days? Harald Bluetooth's body, wherever it truly rests, eludes us through absence of evidence. The death of the Roman philosopher Boethius presents an unsettling mirror image, an event with no shortage of accounts, yet so many conflicting details that historians still can't agree on precisely how, or even exactly where, one of late antiquity's most influential minds met his end. The setting is Pavia, in northern Italy, a city that in the early 6th century AD served as a key stronghold of the Ostrogothic kingdom, which had ruled Italy since Theodoric the Great's conquest of the peninsula decades earlier. Today, within the crypt of the Basilica of San Pietro in Celdoro, an elaborate marble tomb holds remains traditionally venerated as those of Boethius, a philosopher, statesman, and in the eyes of the medieval Catholic Church, a martyr, despite the considerably murkier reality of how, and for what, he actually died. Boethius was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable intellectual figures bridging the classical and medieval worlds. Born into a distinguished Roman senatorial family around 477 AD, he became a leading scholar of Greek philosophy at a time when fluency in Greek was becoming increasingly rare in the Latin-speaking West, and he set himself the extraordinary goal of translating and preserving the entire works of Plato and Aristotle for a Latin readership that would otherwise lose access to them as the classical world receded. He didn't complete this project, but what he did produce, including translations and commentaries on Aristotelian logic, would become foundational texts for medieval European education for the better part of 1,000 years. He rose to become a trusted advisor to Theodoric, eventually achieving the prestigious position of Magister Officiorum, effectively the head of the Ostrogothic court's civil administration, a remarkable height for a Roman aristocrat serving a Gothic king in a kingdom still navigating the uneasy relationship between its Roman population and its Gothic rulers. Then, around 523 AD, everything collapsed. According to Boethius's own account, written during his subsequent imprisonment, he was accused of treasonous correspondence with the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, allegedly conspiring to restore the Eastern Empire's authority over Italy and overthrow Theodoric's rule. Boethius maintained his complete innocence, framing the accusations as the result of court rivals jealous of his position and integrity. And historians today remain genuinely divided on whether the charges held any real substance or were largely fabricated amid the increasingly paranoid final years of Theodoric's reign, a period marked by growing tension between the king's Gothic and Roman subjects and rising suspicion of Roman aristocratic loyalty to Constantinople. What's beyond dispute is that Boethius was imprisoned, likely at Pavia, and that during this imprisonment, awaiting an uncertain fate, he composed his masterwork, The Consolation of Philosophy, written in alternating prose and verse, structured as a dialogue between the imprisoned author and a personification of philosophy herself, who appears to comfort and instruct him on the nature of fortune, justice, and true happiness in the face of his impending death. The work would go on to become one of the most widely read and influential texts of the entire medieval period, translated by figures including King Alfred the Great and Geoffrey Chaucer, studied continuously for over 1,000 years by readers who found in it a strikingly clear-eyed meditation on facing death and injustice with philosophical composure. It's the death itself, though, that resists clean documentation. Surviving accounts of Boethius's execution, written by various later chroniclers, disagree substantially on the method used to kill him. Some sources describe a comparatively swift beheading. Others, considerably more disturbing, describe a prolonged execution involving a cord or rope tightened around his head until, according to these accounts, his eyes were forced from their sockets, followed by a final fatal blow with a club or similar weapon. This second, more brutal account appears in several medieval sources and has been widely repeated in later histories, though modern historians remain uncertain how much of it reflects genuine historical memory versus medieval embellishment, given the centuries separating the event from its surviving written descriptions, and given how readily medieval Christian tradition tended to elaborate the suffering of figures it considered martyrs. This uncertainty over method is compounded by uncertainty over motive and process. We don't have a surviving formal record of any trial, if one occurred at all in a recognizable legal sense, nor clear documentation of exactly how long Boethius's imprisonment lasted before his execution, nor entirely consistent information about precisely where, within or near Pavia, the execution itself took place. Theodoric's own later years are documented as increasingly suspicious and erratic by several surviving sources, and Boethius's death is frequently grouped together with that of his father-in-law, Symmachus, also executed around the same period on related charges. Yet even the sequence and precise relationship between these two deaths isn't fully agreed upon across the surviving historical record. Adding a final stranger layer to this mystery is the question of what happened to Boethius's remains afterward, and how he came to be venerated centuries later as a Christian martyr under the name Saint Severinus, despite the original charges against him having been explicitly political rather than religious in nature. By the time his remains were enshrined in their current location at San Pietro in Cialdoro, sometime in the medieval period, his story had been substantially reshaped by Christian tradition into something resembling religious martyrdom, a transformation that scholars generally view as a later reinterpretation rather than an accurate reflection of the original 6th century circumstances, but one that makes it considerably harder, this many centuries later, to disentangle what actually happened to Boethius from what later generations needed his death to represent. What remains certain is this: one of the last great minds connecting the classical and medieval worlds was imprisoned and killed by a king he had faithfully served for years, over charges whose validity may never be fully assessed, in a manner whose precise brutality is recorded inconsistently across sources written well after the fact, and whose body was later transformed into the relics of a saint whose martyrdom, strictly speaking, was never quite what the original record actually described. Did Boethius die swiftly, the simple victim of a paranoid king's court politics? Or did his final hours unfold with the prolonged cruelty some sources describe, a brutality that medieval Christian tradition would later launder into sanctified suffering, more palatable for veneration than the political execution it most likely was? Boethius's death sits at the boundary between documented history and constructed legend. Centuries earlier, and a continent away, an entire fleet sailed into a similar boundary, between verified historical record and enduring myth, and never definitively returned, leaving behind a question that has occupied Chinese and Japanese historians alike for over 2,000 years. The story begins at the court of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, a ruler whose accomplishments were as extraordinary as his anxieties were profound. Having unified China's warring states into a single empire in 221 BC, standardized its currency, script, and measurements, and begun construction of both the Great Wall and the famous terracotta army intended to guard his tomb for eternity, Qin Shi Huang became increasingly consumed in his later years by a single overwhelming fear: death itself. According to the records of the Grand Historian, compiled by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian roughly a century after these events, the emperor became obsessed with locating an elixir of immortality, dispatching alchemists, court officials, and expeditions across his empire in search of it. Among these was a court magician and alchemist named Shu Fu, who, according to Sima Qian's account, petitioned the emperor around 219 BC, claiming knowledge of 3 mystical islands in the eastern seas, Penglai, Fangzhong, and Yingzhou, said to be inhabited by immortals who possessed the secret of eternal life. Qin Shi Huang, persuaded or desperate enough to act on the claim, funded an expedition under Shu Fu's leadership to locate these islands and retrieve the elixir. The first expedition, according to the historical record, returned empty-handed, with Shufu reportedly claiming that a giant sea creature was blocking the route to the islands and requesting additional resources, including skilled archers, to clear the way. Remarkably, the emperor agreed, and around 210 BC, Shufu set out again. This time, according to Sima Qian's account, with an expedition of almost unimaginable scale. Several thousand young men and women, along with craftsmen, farmers, and supplies for establishing a settlement, suggesting that whatever Shufu's true intentions were, this second voyage was equipped not merely to search, but potentially to colonize whatever land it found. Shufu and his fleet sailed east. According to the official Chinese historical record, they never returned, and no further verified mention of Shufu or his expedition appears in subsequent Chinese imperial chronicles, leaving his fate, and the fate of the thousands who reportedly accompanied him, entirely unresolved within the historical sources that first documented his departure. What happened next exists almost entirely in the realm of legend rather than confirmed history. But it's a legend that has persisted with unusual consistency across multiple cultures and many centuries, which is itself part of what makes this mystery worth examining seriously rather than dismissing outright. In Japan, long-standing local traditions in multiple regions, including sites in Wakayama, Saga, and other coastal areas, claim Shufu and his fleet as their actual founders or early cultural benefactors, with several locations maintaining shrines, purported graves, and commemorative monuments associated with his arrival. These traditions describe Shufu introducing agricultural techniques, particularly rice cultivation, along with various crafts and technologies to early Japanese communities, effectively positioning him as a foundational figure in early Japanese civilization rather than a failed alchemist who simply vanished at sea. Mainstream historians generally treat these Japanese Shufu traditions with considerable caution, for reasons that are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple skepticism. The timeline poses real difficulties. Shufu's expedition is dated to around 210 BC, a period that in Japanese archaeological terms falls within the Yayoi period, during which wet rice agriculture and various continental technologies were indeed being introduced to Japan from the Asian mainland. But this transmission is generally understood by archaeologists as a gradual process involving numerous waves of migration and contact over an extended period, rather than a single dramatic founding voyage led by one named historical individual. Additionally, no archaeological evidence directly linking any site in Japan to Shufu specifically, as opposed to the broader pattern of continental cultural transmission during this era, has ever been confirmed. And yet the tradition's persistence and geographic spread across multiple, independently maintained local Japanese sites is itself a genuine historical puzzle worth acknowledging. These aren't recent inventions. Many of the associated shrines and commemorative traditions have documented histories stretching back many centuries, suggesting either a remarkably durable and widespread legend that took root independently in multiple Japanese communities, possibly absorbing and localizing earlier, less specific traditions about continental visitors, or in a more speculative reading that some researchers find plausible rather than provable, a folk memory preserving some genuine kernel of contact between Shufu's expedition, or some similar voyage from Chinara, China, and early Japanese communities during this exact, archaeologically attested period of continental cultural transmission. Other theories, more speculative still, have proposed alternative destinations for Shufu's fleet entirely, including Pacific routes or other parts of coastal East Asia, none of which carry significant supporting evidence beyond inference, and none of which have displaced Japan as the dominant location associated with the legend across the centuries. What we're left with, in the end, is a documented historical departure with no documented arrival anywhere, an emperor's last, desperate expedition in search of immortality, vanishing from the official record the moment it sailed past the Chinese coastline, only to reappear, centuries later and oceans away, as the founding figure of local traditions in a country whose own archaeological record genuinely does show new technologies and peoples arriving from the continent during roughly this same window of time. Did Shufu's fleet sink somewhere in the waters between China and Japan, its thousands of passengers lost to the sea along with whatever immortality they were never going to find? Did some portion of that expedition actually make landfall, settling quietly into communities that would, centuries later, claim him as their own founding ancestor? Or does the truth lie somewhere in between? A real voyage, its details slowly reshaped by 2,000 years of retelling until the line between the historical Shufu and the legendary one became impossible to fully separate. Shufu's fleet sailed toward legend. The library at Nalanda sailed, in a sense, toward fire. And what burned there may represent one of the single greatest losses of recorded human knowledge in history, made all the more haunting by how little we actually know about what, precisely, was lost. The site itself, in the modern Indian state of Bihar, is today a vast field of excavated red brick ruins, monastery courtyards, meditation cells, and the foundations of towering structures that once housed one of the ancient world's great centers of learning. Founded sometime in the 5th century AD, likely under the patronage of the Gupta dynasty, Nalanda grew over the following 7 centuries into a Buddhist monastic university of staggering scale and international reputation, drawing students and scholars not just from across the Indian subcontinent, but from Tibet, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. At its peak, historical accounts, including the detailed travel records of the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, who studied there in the 7th century, describe a residential student population numbering in the thousands, supported by an extensive curriculum covering not only Buddhist philosophy and theology, but logic, grammar, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. At the center of this institution stood its library, known as Dharmaganja, or Mountain of Truth, reportedly so extensive that later traditions describe it as comprising 3 separate multi-story buildings, one of which, called Ratnodadi, or Sea of Jewels, is said to have risen 9 stories high, housing the university's most precious and sacred manuscripts. What did Nalanda's library actually contain? This is where the mystery begins, because the honest answer is that we don't fully know, not because no records exist, but because the records that do exist are fragmentary, scattered across the accounts of visiting scholars rather than preserved as any kind of comprehensive catalog from the institution itself. Xuanzang's writings, along with those of other visiting monks such as Yijing, who studied at Nalanda later in the 7th century, describe vast collections of Buddhist sutras and philosophical treatises, commentaries spanning centuries of scholarly debate, and texts on subjects extending well beyond religious study into the sciences and mathematics of the period. Some later traditions claim the library held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and texts. Modern historians generally treat the most extreme of these figures with caution, as they derive from later, more legendary retellings rather than contemporary documentation. But even conservative estimates suggest a collection of genuinely extraordinary size and scholarly depth for its era, quite possibly unmatched anywhere else in the world at the time. This is, in itself, a kind of vanishing, not of the building, but of accurate knowledge about its actual contents, lost somewhere in the gap between what visiting scholars chose to record in their personal accounts and the comprehensive institutional records that, if they ever existed in the form of formal catalogs, have not survived to tell us precisely what stood on those shelves. Then came the destruction. Around 1193 AD, military forces under Bakhtiar Khilji, part of the broader wave of conquest extending Turkic Muslim rule into northern India during this period, attacked and sacked Nalanda. The most widely repeated historical accounts, drawing primarily from the later Persian chronicler Minhaj-i-Siraj, writing several decades after the events he described, state that the university's monks were killed and its library set ablaze, with some traditions holding that the fires burned for months, the sheer volume of manuscript material fueling flames that smoldered far longer than any single building reasonably should have, consuming centuries of accumulated scholarship in a single catastrophic event. Modern historians broadly accept that Nalanda was indeed destroyed during this period, and that this destruction effectively ended the institution's centuries-long role as a center of learning, marking, for many, a symbolic close to the broader tradition of Buddhist monastic universities that had flourished across northern India for the better part of a millennium. But several specific details, repeated endlessly in popular retellings, rest on less certain ground than the core fact of the destruction itself. The dramatic claim that the fires burned for months specifically comes from accounts written well after the event, and some historians have questioned whether this detail reflects genuine historical memory or later embellishment designed to emphasize the sheer scale of what was lost. Similarly, while Minhaji Siraj's account remains the primary near-contemporary source for the attack, it offers relatively brief detail regarding the library specifically, leaving later historians to reconstruct and interpret the scope of the loss largely through inference rather than direct documentary description. This uncertainty opens space for genuinely difficult and still debated questions. Did any portion of Nalanda's library survive the attack, smuggled out or otherwise preserved by monks who managed to flee before or during the destruction? Tibetan Buddhist tradition maintains that significant numbers of Sanskrit Buddhist texts were carried out of India in the centuries surrounding Nalanda's decline and translated into Tibetan, preserving the content, if not the original physical manuscripts, of texts that might otherwise have been entirely lost when northern Indian Buddhist institutions were destroyed. Some scholars believe a meaningful portion of Nalanda's scholarly tradition survives today specifically because of this earlier pattern of translation and transmission to Tibet, meaning the knowledge, even if not the original library itself, may not be quite as completely vanished as the dramatic image of a burning building suggests. Archaeology, meanwhile, has added its own quiet complications to the story. Excavations at the Nalanda site, ongoing since the early 20th century, have uncovered extensive physical ruins, but perhaps unsurprisingly given the fire described in the historical accounts, very few surviving manuscripts, leaving the archaeological record largely silent on the specific question of the library's final contents, even as it confirms the scale and sophistication of the institution that once stood there. What remains, ultimately, is a profound and still only partially answered question about the true scope of what was lost at Nalanda, a library whose contents were never fully cataloged in any surviving record, destroyed in an attack whose most dramatic details rest on accounts written after the fact, leaving historians to reconstruct the magnitude of the loss largely through absence rather than evidence. Did centuries of irreplaceable scholarship genuinely burn for months on end, as later tradition insists? Did some meaningful fraction escape, carried beyond the reach of the flames into Tibetan monasteries where it survives still, unrecognized for what it once was part of? Or does the truest tragedy lie simply in this, that we will likely never know with certainty just how much of human knowledge disappeared that day, because no one ever finished writing down what was there to lose in the first place? The library at Nalanda fell to fire that consumed centuries of recorded knowledge in a matter of months. A century before construction even began on that vast Buddhist university, a different, far stranger phenomenon was already unsettling chroniclers across an entire continent. Not flames consuming the written word, but a darkening, discoloring sky that left contemporary observers struggling to find the words to describe what they were seeing at all. The starting point for this mystery is a single, devastating year, 536 AD, remembered by climate historians today as the beginning of what's now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and described by at least one modern historian as, quite possibly, the worst year to be alive in recorded human history. The event itself is no longer seriously disputed by mainstream science. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, along with tree ring data from sites across Europe, Asia, and North America, confirm a sudden, severe global cooling event beginning in 536 AD, almost certainly triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, or possibly a closely spaced series of eruptions that injected enormous quantities of sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere. A second major eruption around 540 AD compounded the effect, plunging large parts of the northern hemisphere into roughly a decade of abnormally cold temperatures, failed harvests, and widespread famine. What makes this event a genuine mystery isn't the cooling itself, which is well documented through hard climatological evidence. It's what contemporary observers, living through it without any scientific framework for understanding volcanic dust veils or aerosol-driven climate disruption, actually reported seeing in the sky above them. Descriptions that, read collectively across multiple independent chroniclers writing in different languages in different parts of the world, paint a picture of a sky that had become, in some fundamental way, simply wrong. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing in his account of Emperor Justinian's wars, described a sun that gave forth its light without brightness, comparing it to the moon, for the better part of a year, noting that it appeared, in his words, as if in a perpetual eclipse, and that crops failed, and people suffered as though the seasons themselves had lost their proper order. The Roman statesman Cassiodorus, in an official letter written during this same period, described the sun as having taken on an unusual, weakened, bluish quality, its heat diminished, its light somehow altered in a way that left the natural world disrupted. Chinese chronicles from the same period independently describe similar phenomena. A dimmed sun, yellow dust reportedly falling like snow, and crop failures consistent with the same global cooling event now confirmed by ice cores thousands of miles away. Irish annals from this period also record sustained failures of bread, language strongly suggesting agricultural catastrophe across an entirely separate region, again independently corroborating the broader pattern. This much sits on reasonably firm historical and scientific ground. Something genuinely altered the appearance of the sky across multiple continents simultaneously, for a sustained period, severe enough that observers with no contact with one another, writing in different languages and political contexts, all felt compelled to record it as something deeply abnormal. Where this mystery moves from documented climate history into more genuinely uncertain territory is in the specific, scattered, and considerably less consistent accounts of unusual lights and colors in the sky during this same broader period of atmospheric disruption. Accounts that are harder to verify, harder to date precisely, and far more dependent on later transmission and possible embellishment than the more straightforward corroborated reports of a dimmed sun. Scattered across various early medieval chronicles, monastic annals, and later folk traditions from across Europe are references to strange lights appearing in the night sky during the broader era of this climatic disruption. Luminous phenomena described in some sources as glowing, in others as moving or shifting in unusual ways, occasionally described using color terms that, when later translated and interpreted by modern historians, have sometimes been rendered as green or greenish, though this is an area where caution is genuinely warranted, given the difficulties inherent in translating medieval color terminology, which often mapped onto concepts of brightness, saturation, or category in ways that don't correspond neatly to modern color vocabulary. The mainstream scientific explanation for at least some of these accounts is, in fact, fairly well grounded. Aurora activity. The Earth's magnetic field can produce vivid shifting lights in the night sky, typically appearing as greens, reds, and purples, usually confined to high-latitude regions, but, during periods of intense geomagnetic storms, visible at far lower latitudes than usual. Major volcanic eruptions, while not directly causing auroras, can sometimes coincide with periods of unusual atmospheric and even geomagnetic disruption, and severe climatic upheaval of the kind documented in 536 AD would naturally have left observers more attentive than usual to any unusual sky phenomena occurring around the same period, more likely to record and pass down accounts of celestial oddities precisely because the world already felt as though it had gone wrong. This is where the explanation, while plausible, runs into a genuine evidentiary limitation that honest historians acknowledge rather than paper over. Precisely dated, clearly described, independently corroborated accounts of green lights specifically, tied directly and unambiguously to the 536 AD event and its aftermath, are considerably harder to pin down than the well-documented dimmed sun accounts from Procopius and Cassiodorus. Much of what circulates in popular retellings of this period draws on a wider, looser body of early medieval references to unusual sky phenomena. Comets, meteor showers, aurora sightings, and atmospheric optical effects, spanning a broader window of centuries rather than the specific several-year span of the dust veil event itself, with later compilers and storytellers sometimes drawing these threads together into a more unified dramatic narrative than the original, scattered sources fully support on their own. This doesn't mean the phenomenon wasn't real. Aurora activity during this period is entirely plausible on scientific grounds, and some chroniclers across early medieval Europe did record sky phenomena they found difficult to categorize using their existing vocabulary for comets, eclipses, or ordinary weather. What it means is that the specific, vivid image of green lights hanging over a darkened, famine-stricken Europe is, in its most dramatic popular form, partly a modern reconstruction, a plausible synthesis built from genuine scientific understanding of aurora behavior, genuine and well-documented accounts of an abnormally dim and discolored sun, and scattered, harder-to-verify references to unusual lights drawn from sources spanning a wider period than the dust veil event alone. The more speculative end of this discussion includes proposals that go beyond mainstream volcanic and aurora explanations entirely, including suggestions, generally given little weight by mainstream historians and scientists, that a comet, or even an atmospheric impact event, may have contributed to the 536 AD disruption alongside, or instead of, volcanic activity, potentially accounting for additional luminous phenomena beyond what volcanic dust veils alone would typically produce. Most current scientific evidence, based on ice core sulfate deposits matching known volcanic signatures, continues to favor volcanic eruption as the primary driver of the 536 AD event specifically. But the broader question of whether additional, less common atmospheric or even astronomical factors contributed to the unusual sky phenomena reported across this wider period remains, in the more cautious corners of the scholarship, not entirely closed. What we're left with, in the end, is a genuinely documented climatic catastrophe, confirmed by hard physical evidence from ice cores and tree rings on multiple continents, surrounded by a haze of contemporary human testimony attempting, in real time, and without any modern scientific framework, to describe a sky that had stopped behaving the way skies were supposed to behave. Some of that testimony is precise and well corroborated. A sun without brightness, color without warmth, crops that failed under light too weak to ripen them. Other parts of it are looser, scattered across centuries and cultures, color and shape blurred by translation, time, and the very human tendency to make sense of the inexplicable by reaching for whatever vocabulary was available. Did medieval Europeans, huddled through a decade of failed harvests and unnatural cold, genuinely witness vivid green lights moving across their darkened skies, born from the same magnetic disturbances that still paint the aurora across northern latitudes today? Or have centuries of retelling gradually woven together a dimmed sun, a handful of genuine but ambiguous celestial sightings, and our own modern fascination with the uncanny into an image more vivid and more unified than what anyone actually saw at the time? Either way, something undeniably strange passed over the world in 536 AD, recorded, however imperfectly, by people on opposite sides of the planet, who had no way of knowing they were witnessing the same event, and no language adequate to fully describe what, exactly, they were looking at. The strange lights over medieval Europe were, at least in part, witnessed and recorded by people trying to make sense of what they saw. In southern Ohio, an entirely different kind of ancient mystery survives. Not a written account of something fleeting, but a permanent monumental shape pressed into the earth itself, built by people who left us no writing at all, and whose true purpose we are left to reconstruct almost entirely from the shape's own silent geometry. The Great Serpent Mound stretches across a plateau above Ohio Brush Creek, an enormous effigy earthwork nearly 401 meters long, its body coiling through 7 distinct undulations before culminating in a tightly spiraled tail at one end, and at the other, an open oval shape often interpreted as a serpent's head, or possibly its jaws opened around an egg-like form. Built from piled earth and clay, rising only about a meter above the surrounding ground at its highest point, the effigy is invisible in its true form to anyone standing on the ground beside it. Its serpentine shape only becomes fully comprehensible from above, a detail that has fueled both careful archaeological inquiry and considerably less careful speculation for well over a century. For decades, the conventional dating placed Serpent Mound's construction with the Adena culture, a Native American culture that flourished in the Ohio Valley region from roughly 800 BC to 100 AD, known for building numerous burial mounds and earthworks throughout the region. This attribution made intuitive sense, given the Adena's well-documented mound-building activity nearby, and it held as the standard scholarly position for much of the 20th century. Then, in 1996, radiocarbon dating of charcoal samples recovered from within the mound structure produced results pointing to a considerably later construction date, around 1070 AD, placing its builders not within the Adena culture at all, but within the Fort Ancient culture, a separate Native American culture that inhabited the region during the Mississippian period of North American prehistory. This finding ignited genuine, ongoing scholarly debate that has never been fully settled. Subsequent research, including additional radiocarbon dating conducted in the following years, has produced somewhat mixed results, with some samples supporting the later Fort Ancient dating, and others suggesting the mound may, in fact, have earlier Adena period origins after all, possibly with later modification or rebuilding by Fort Ancient peoples centuries afterward. The most current, broadly cautious scholarly position holds that the mound's precise construction date and the specific cultural group or groups responsible for it remains genuinely unresolved, with reasonable evidence supporting multiple possible scenarios rather than a single confirmed answer. This uncertainty about who built Serpent Mound and exactly when would be puzzle enough on its own. But the mound's specific shape and orientation have generated an additional, considerably more debated layer of mystery, centered on a question that sits right at the boundary between rigorous archaeoastronomy and more speculative interpretation. Was Serpent Mound deliberately constructed as an astronomical instrument, encoding celestial alignments into its sinuous form? Several specific alignments have been proposed and studied with varying degrees of scholarly rigor. The most frequently cited involves the mound's head and the open oval shape at its terminus, which several researchers have argued aligns with the summer solstice sunset, observed from the mound's coils looking toward the head. Additional proposed alignments involve the mound's curves potentially corresponding to the positions of sunrise and sunset at both solstices, and even, in some more elaborate interpretations, with lunar standstill positions, a considerably more complex celestial cycle involving the moon's rising and setting points over an 18.6-year period, a cycle that, if genuinely encoded into the mound structure, would represent a remarkably sophisticated piece of long-term astronomical observation and planning for any ancient society to incorporate into a single earthwork. Mainstream archaeoastronomers approach these claims with a notably mixed and carefully qualified response. The solstice alignment involving the serpent's head and the oval shape has received relatively more support among researchers who've studied the site using rigorous surveying methods, in part because solstice alignments are common and well documented across numerous confirmed ancient earthworks and monuments throughout the Ohio Valley region and beyond, making such an alignment at Serpent Mound entirely plausible within the broader pattern of known Native American astronomical practice in this region. The more elaborate proposed alignments, particularly those involving lunar standstills and multiple simultaneous astronomical correspondences across the mound's full, sinuous length, have received considerably more scholarly skepticism, with critics noting that a shape as long, curving, and irregular as Serpent Mound will inevitably produce numerous apparent alignments with various celestial events simply through the mathematics of probability, especially when researchers are free to select which specific points along an extended winding structure to measure from. This tension between confirmed, scientifically grounded alignment with the summer solstice and more elaborate, less universally accepted astronomical claims, sits at the heart of why Serpent Mound remains so genuinely debated, even among serious researchers operating well within mainstream academic archaeology, without needing to reach for fringe explanations to find real, unresolved scholarly disagreement. Adding a further layer of genuine scientific intrigue, rather than speculation, is the mound's geological setting. Serpent Mound sits atop a highly unusual geological feature known as the Serpent Mound crypto-explosion structure, a roughly circular zone of intensely disturbed, fractured bedrock spanning approximately 8 kilometers in diameter. Geologists have studied this formation extensively, and the leading scientific explanation, now broadly accepted within the geological community, identifies it as an impact crater, formed by a meteorite strike that occurred long before any human habitation of the region, estimated at somewhere between 250 and 300 million years ago, well into the deep geological past, vastly predating not just Native American civilization in North America, but humanity as a species entirely. This raises a genuinely fascinating, if ultimately unresolved, question. Did the ancient builders of Serpent Mound, whoever they specifically were, recognize something unusual about this particular landscape, choosing the site deliberately because of its distinctive disturbed geology, long before anyone possessed the scientific tools to understand that disturbance as evidence of an ancient meteorite impact? There's no direct written or oral historical record confirming this intention, since the mound's builders left no writing system behind to explain their reasoning. But the coincidence of an effigy mound, widely interpreted by many researchers as serpent imagery, built directly atop a genuinely unusual and visually distinct geological anomaly, has struck numerous researchers and visitors alike as unlikely to be entirely accidental, even as direct proof of intentional site selection for this specific reason remains, by the nature of the evidence available, essentially impossible to confirm with certainty. This is where the more speculative end of Serpent Mound interpretation tends to gather, ranging from reasonably grounded suggestions that the area's unusual terrain, regardless of whether its builders understood its impact origin specifically, may have held some recognized spiritual or symbolic significance within regional Native American tradition, through to considerably more fringe theories proposing direct ancient awareness of the impact event itself, passed down through oral tradition across vast and scientifically improbable stretches of time, a claim that finds little support among archaeologists and anthropologists studying the actual, documented oral traditions of cultures connected to the region. What we're ultimately left with at Serpent Mound is a structure shaped by genuine, layered uncertainty at almost every level of inquiry. We don't know with full confidence which culture built it, or even whether a single culture built the entire effigy in one sustained construction effort, as opposed to an initial structure later modified or expanded by different people in a different era. We have reasonably solid evidence for at least one deliberate solar alignment, alongside more contested claims of additional, more elaborate astronomical encoding that remain genuinely disputed within serious scholarship rather than settled fact. And we have an undeniably striking, scientifically confirmed geological anomaly underlying the entire site, whose connection, if any, to the builder's original intentions and choice of location remains a question we may simply lack the evidence to ever fully answer, given the absence of any written record from the people who shaped this earth into the form it still holds today. The serpent still coils across its Ohio plateau, exactly as it has for centuries, its true age debated, its precise meaning unrecorded, resting atop bedrock shattered by a violence from the sky that occurred hundreds of millions of years before any human hand ever touched that ground. Did its builders know what lay beneath their feet, choosing this place because something about it already felt marked, set apart, significant in ways even they may not have been able to fully articulate? Or is the alignment between the serpent's ancient form and the crater's far more ancient violence simply one of history's more striking coincidences? Two unrelated mysteries, separated by hundreds of millions of years, that happen to settle, by chance alone, into exactly the same patch of Earth. The coincidence at Serpent Mound rests on bedrock evidence we can measure and date. The mystery surrounding St. Brendan the Navigator rests on something far more fragile: a single medieval text describing a voyage that may, or may not, have reached a continent no European was supposed to know existed. The physical anchor for this story is Ardfert, in County Kerry on Ireland's rugged southwestern coast, where ruins of a monastery traditionally associated with Brendan still stand, overlooking the same Atlantic waters that, according to legend, carried him and a small crew of monks on a voyage lasting 7 years, in search of a land the medieval text describing the journey calls Terra Repermissionis Sanctorum, the promised land of the saints. Brendan himself was a genuine, historically documented figure, an Irish monk born around 484 AD, who founded several monasteries across Ireland, including the influential monastery at Clonfert, and who died sometime around 577 or 583 AD, depending on which early source is consulted. His historical existence as a respected early Irish Christian leader isn't in serious dispute. What is far more uncertain is the famous voyage attributed to him, recorded not in any contemporary account from his own lifetime, but in a text called the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, the Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot, which scholars generally date to sometime between the 9th and 10th centuries, meaning it was written down roughly 3 to 4 centuries after Brendan himself reportedly lived, placing it squarely in that familiar, frustrating gap between a historical figure's actual life and the later literary tradition that grew up around their legend. According to the Navigatio, Brendan set out from Ireland with a crew of fellow monks in a curragh, a traditional Irish boat constructed from a wooden frame covered in tarred leather hides, in search of a paradise he had heard described by another monk who claimed to have visited it. What follows in the text is an extended, richly detailed account of islands encountered along the way, many described with vivid and strange imagery. An island that turns out to be the back of an enormous sea creature, upon which the monks unknowingly make camp and light a fire. An island inhabited entirely by birds who speak with human voices and sing psalms in time with the liturgical calendar. Pillars of crystal rising from the sea. And eventually, after years of voyaging, the discovery of the promised land itself, described as a vast country across a great river, bright and fertile, before Brendan and his crew finally returned home to Ireland. Read purely as religious allegory, much of the Navigatio fits comfortably within a well-established medieval genre, blending Christian pilgrimage narrative with older Irish literary traditions of otherworldly sea voyages, known in Irish literature as Imrama, which similarly describe heroes journeying by sea to fantastical island realms. Most mainstream historians and literary scholars approach the text first and foremost as a work of religious and literary imagination, rich with symbolic meaning, rather than a literal travelogue meant to document an actual geographic journey. And yet the Navigatio doesn't read purely as fantasy either, which is precisely what has kept this mystery alive in serious scholarly circles for well over a century, rather than confining it to the realm of pure folklore. Several specific details within the text correspond with striking, if not conclusive, plausibility to real geographic features and phenomena a medieval Irish sailor might genuinely have encountered while voyaging into the North Atlantic. The island that turns out to be a sea creature has long been suggested by various researchers as a plausible, if embellished, description of an actual encounter with a large whale. References to pillars of crystal rising from the sea bear a notable resemblance to icebergs, an entirely plausible sight for sailors venturing into northern Atlantic waters toward Iceland or Greenland. Descriptions of fiery mountains and foul-smelling smoke encountered on certain islands align reasonably well with volcanic activity, consistent with Iceland's well-documented geology. None of these correspondences proves the voyage happened as described, but their cumulative presence has led many historians to take the underlying premise of the Navigatio considerably more seriously than its more fantastical surface details might otherwise warrant on their own. This is where the central, unresolved historical question comes into focus. Did Brendan, or some genuine early medieval Irish monastic voyage that later became attached to his name and reputation, actually undertake a long-distance Atlantic crossing, possibly reaching Iceland or the Faroe Islands, or conceivably even further? and was an authentic account of that voyage, written closer to the actual events, eventually lost or absorbed into the later, more embellished religious narrative that survives today as the Navigatio? This question gained considerable modern attention and a genuine practical test in 1976 and 1977, when British explorer and writer Tim Severin constructed a traditional curragh built using historically accurate materials and methods comparable to what would have been available to a 6th century Irish monk, and sailed it from Ireland to Newfoundland by way of the Hebrides, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, deliberately following a northern route consistent with details described in the Navigatio. Severin's voyage successfully demonstrated that such a journey was, in fact, physically achievable, using technology genuinely available during Brendan's lifetime, surviving rough North Atlantic conditions and reaching North American shores using nothing more advanced than what 6th century Irish monks would have had access to. Severin's voyage proved feasibility. It did not, and could not, prove that Brendan himself, specifically, made the journey described in a text written centuries after his death, an important distinction that responsible historians and Severin himself have generally been careful to maintain, even as the successful crossing lent considerable new credibility to the broader idea that the Navigatio's fantastical narrative might be built atop a kernel of genuine early medieval maritime achievement, however much later religious and literary elaboration had reshaped the original account into something considerably stranger than whatever actual voyage may have inspired it. This is also where the more speculative and considerably more contested end of the Brendan mystery begins. Various researchers and enthusiasts over the past several centuries have proposed that Brendan's promised land represents an early, garbled account of North America itself, predating Norse contact by several centuries, and some have gone further still, pointing to disputed inscriptions and stone formations in various North American locations as possible evidence of early Irish monastic presence on the continent. Mainstream archaeologists and historians remain deeply skeptical of these specific claimed physical traces, generally finding the proposed evidence inconclusive at best, and the product of natural geological processes or considerably later activity at worst, and no broadly accepted archaeological discovery comparable to the confirmed Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows has ever emerged to support an actual pre-Norse Irish presence in North America. The gap between demonstrated technical feasibility and confirmed historical fact remains, on this specific question, genuinely wide. What we're left with, then, is a text written centuries after its subject's death, blending what appears to be authentic, geographically plausible maritime detail with extensive religious symbolism and literary embellishment drawn from older Irish storytelling traditions, describing a voyage that has been physically proven achievable using period-accurate technology, attributed to a historically real monk whose actual life included no contemporary written record of any such journey at all. Did some version of Brendan, or perhaps several Irish monks whose various voyages were later combined and attributed to his more famous name, genuinely sail far out into the North Atlantic, encountering real islands, real ice, real volcanic landscapes, in a journey whose authentic details were gradually buried beneath centuries of religious reimagining before the Navigatio was finally written down? Or does the Navigatio represent something closer to its more conventional scholarly reading, a work of skilled religious allegory drawing loosely on genuine knowledge of the North Atlantic's geography without ever describing an actual journey that took place? Somewhere in the gap between Ardfurt's quiet monastic ruins and the cold, proven waters of the North Atlantic route Tim Severin successfully sailed centuries later, the original truth behind Brendan's voyage, whatever it specifically was, remains exactly where it has stayed for over 1,000 years, recorded only in a text too symbolic to fully trust and too geographically plausible to entirely dismiss. Brendan's truth, if it exists, lies somewhere between symbol and sea. In the floodplain of the Mississippi River, across from modern St. Louis, an entirely different ancient mystery survives in earth rather than text. The largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, which appeared with startling speed, thrived for centuries, and then emptied out so thoroughly that by the time Europeans arrived, no one remained who could explain what had happened. Cahokia rises from the Illinois floodplain in a series of massive earthen mounds, the largest of which, known today as Monk's Mound, covers nearly 6 hectares at its base and reaches roughly 30 meters in height, making it the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, larger in ground footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza, though built from packed earth rather than stone, requiring an estimated 815,000 cubic meters of soil moved entirely by human labor, one basket load at a time, without draft animals or the wheel. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia is estimated by archaeologists to have housed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with some estimates running higher still when accounting for surrounding satellite communities, making it larger than London at the same period in history, and a population that wouldn't be matched again by any city within the present-day United States until well after European colonization. What makes Cahokia's story particularly striking and particularly difficult to fully explain is the speed of its emergence. Archaeological evidence indicates that around 1050 AD, the settlement underwent a dramatic, remarkably rapid transformation, sometimes referred to among archaeologists as the Cahokia Big Bang. A sudden, large-scale reorganization of the landscape involving extensive new mound construction, the leveling and replanning of residential areas, and population growth occurring within a time frame that some researchers estimate at little more than a single generation. This kind of rapid, centrally organized urban planning, appearing seemingly out of relatively modest prior settlement in this specific location, has prompted considerable scholarly discussion about what social, religious, or political catalyst could have driven such swift and dramatic change without any clear written record from the people who built it to explain their own motivations. Among Cahokia's most intriguing structures is a large circular arrangement of wooden posts that archaeologists have nicknamed Woodhenge, due to its resemblance in function, if not appearance, to Britain's famous Stonehenge. Several successive versions of this timber circle were constructed at the site over time, generally interpreted as a solar calendar device, with specific posts aligned to mark the sunrise positions at the solstices and equinoxes when viewed from a central observation point. This alignment isn't seriously disputed among archaeologists studying the site. It represents confirmed, careful astronomical observation incorporated directly into Cahokia's urban and ceremonial landscape, evidence of a society with both the organizational sophistication and the long-term planning capacity to track and architecturally encode complex celestial cycles. Cahokia's society also left behind more troubling evidence, particularly at a structure known as Mound 72, a smaller ridgetop mound where excavations in the 1960s and 1970s uncovered a series of remarkable and, in places, genuinely unsettling burials. Among these was the so-called beaded burial, featuring the remains of a man laid upon a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged in the shape of a falcon, accompanied by other high-status burials nearby, suggesting an individual or small group of considerable social and possibly religious importance. Elsewhere within the same mound, excavators uncovered mass burials showing clear evidence of human sacrifice, including groups of young women buried together, and, in a separate burial pit, a group of individuals who appear to have been killed and buried simultaneously, some showing evidence suggesting they may have been buried alive, judging from skeletal positioning consistent with attempted resistance or struggle at the moment of interment. These findings indicate that Cahokian society, alongside its sophisticated astronomical and architectural achievements, also practiced large-scale ritual human sacrifice, almost certainly connected to its religious and political structures in ways that remain only partially understood, given the absence of any written explanation from Cahokia's own people regarding the specific beliefs underlying these practices. It's against this backdrop of rapid rise, sophisticated achievement, and genuinely dark ritual practice that Cahokia's eventual abandonment becomes such a compelling and still unresolved mystery. By around 1200 AD, archaeological evidence suggests Cahokia's population had already begun a sustained decline from its peak. By approximately 1350 AD, the site appears to have been substantially depopulated, and by 1400 AD, Cahokia was, for all practical purposes, abandoned entirely, its great mounds left to the elements, its plazas and residential areas reclaimed by surrounding wilderness, centuries before any European explorer would arrive to ask what had once stood there. Unlike Nalanda, there was no foreign army, no recorded conquest, no chronicled sack to point to as a clear, single, triggering catastrophe. Cahokia's people, whoever their direct descendants among later Native American nations may be, appear to have simply left, gradually, over the course of roughly a century and a half, taking with them an understanding of their own history and motivations that was never committed to any writing system archaeologists have been able to recover. The mainstream explanations for Cahokia's decline generally point toward a convergence of environmental and social pressures rather than any single decisive cause. Some researchers have proposed that Cahokia's enormous, concentrated population placed unsustainable strain on the surrounding environment, with extensive deforestation for construction and fuel, potentially increasing flooding and erosion risk across the floodplain the city depended on for agriculture. Others point to climatic shifts during this broader period, including increased flooding events and changing precipitation patterns documented in regional sediment records, which may have undermined the intensive maize agriculture that supported Cahokia's large population. Still others emphasize internal social and political factors. The strain of maintaining centralized authority over such an unusually large population for this region and era, potential factional conflict among Cahokian elites, or gradually eroding social cohesion as the same religious and political structures that had enabled the city's rapid rise eventually proved difficult to sustain across multiple generations. Each of these explanations finds some genuine archaeological support, and most current scholarship treats Cahokia's decline as the product of several overlapping pressures compounding one another over time, rather than any single dramatic event. But the precise sequence, the specific tipping points, and above all the lived experience and decision-making of the people who ultimately chose to leave a city their ancestors had built with such extraordinary ambition, remain genuinely difficult to reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone, absent any surviving written or clearly preserved oral account directly describing the abandonment from Cahokia's own perspective. This evidentiary gap has left room for more speculative interpretations as well, including questions about whether the dramatic religious and sacrificial practices evidenced at sites like Mound 72 might reflect periods of significant social stress or upheaval within Cahokian society well before its final decline, with large-scale ritual sacrifice potentially representing attempts by religious or political leaders to maintain social order or divine favor amid growing environmental and social strain, though this connection remains an interpretive hypothesis rather than a directly evidenced conclusion, given how little we can know with certainty about the internal religious reasoning of a society that left no written record explaining its own rituals. What remains, walking among Cahokia's mounds today, is a landscape that speaks clearly to ambition, sophistication, and capability. A society that organized tens of thousands of people, tracked complex celestial cycles with genuine precision, and reshaped an entire floodplain according to a coherent, deliberate urban vision within the span of a single generation. And it speaks just as clearly, through its eventual emptying, to vulnerability, whether environmental, social, or some combination. Neither archaeology nor oral tradition has fully preserved for us to understand with confidence. Did Cahokia's people watch their floodplain slowly fail them, choosing to disperse gradually toward better land as their environment turned against the very agricultural system that had made the city's growth possible in the first place? Did political or religious crisis, perhaps connected to the same sacrificial practices uncovered at Mound 72, eventually fracture a society that had once been unified enough to move hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth in pursuit of a shared vision? Or did Cahokia's decline result from some combination of pressures so gradual and so thoroughly unrecorded by its own departing residents that the true sequence of decisions behind one of pre-Columbian North America's greatest and most mysterious vanishings may simply be lost to us now, buried as deeply as the city's own founders once buried their dead beneath Mound 72's quiet earth? Cahokia's silence is the silence of a city whose builders left no writing to explain themselves. Across the Atlantic in Ireland's Boyne Valley, an even older monument presents an oddly inverted version of the same problem, a structure whose original builders left no writing either, but which was later visited, reused, and reinterpreted by people who did write, leaving behind a tangle of medieval mythology layered awkwardly over a purpose that, by their own time, had already been lost for thousands of years. Newgrange sits within a great bend of the River Boyne, a massive circular mound roughly 85 meters in diameter and 13 meters high, its facade faced with bright white quartz stone, fronted by an entrance stone carved with intricate swirling triple spiral and lozenge motifs that remain among the most recognizable examples of Neolithic art anywhere in Europe. Constructed around 3200 BC, Newgrange predates Stonehenge's main Sarsen structure by several centuries, and predates the Great Pyramid of Giza by a comparable margin, making it one of the oldest deliberately constructed monumental structures still standing anywhere on Earth. Its core architectural achievement is, by now, well understood and rigorously confirmed. A narrow stone passage, roughly 19 meters long, leads from the monument's entrance into a central chamber with 3 smaller recesses branching off it. Above the entrance sits a carefully constructed opening known as the roof box, positioned with such extraordinary precision that for several mornings surrounding the winter solstice each year, a narrow beam of sunlight travels directly down the length of the passage, illuminating the central chamber for a matter of minutes before retreating, an alignment confirmed by archaeologists and witnessed by modern visitors through an annual lottery system that allows a small number of people to experience it firsthand each December. This solar alignment, requiring extraordinarily precise architectural planning by a Neolithic farming society without writing, metal tools, or the wheel, remains one of the most impressive confirmed achievements of prehistoric European engineering, and stands as the least disputed part of Newgrange's identity. This was, without serious scholarly doubt, a monument built with profound intentionality around the turning of the year's darkest point. What remains genuinely uncertain, even after a century and a half of archaeological study, is the monument's full original purpose beyond this solar function. Human remains, both cremated and unburned, have been recovered from within the chamber, leading to Newgrange's common classification as a passage tomb, a burial monument. But the relatively small quantity of remains found, especially when measured against the truly enormous labor investment required to construct the monument, has led many archaeologists to suggest that straightforward burial may have been only one function among several, with the monument potentially serving broader ceremonial, religious, or community purposes extending well beyond simply housing the dead, in ways the physical evidence alone cannot fully specify. This uncertainty about Newgrange's original Neolithic purpose, significant as it is, sits alongside an entirely separate layer of mystery. Clear archaeological evidence that the monument continued to attract human visitors and ritual activity for literally thousands of years after its original Neolithic builders had died out, their society replaced by entirely different cultures who nonetheless kept returning to this same mound generation after generation, era after era, leaving behind material evidence of their visits without any of them, as far as we can tell, retaining genuine knowledge of who had built it or precisely why. Excavations at Newgrange have recovered a striking range of artifacts dating from well after the monument's Neolithic construction, spanning the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and into the Roman period and beyond, despite the fact that Ireland itself was never part of the Roman Empire. Among the more notable finds are Roman coins, gold jewelry, and other items consistent with Roman period material culture, deposited at or near the entrance to the monument centuries, and in some cases millennia, after its original construction, generally interpreted by archaeologists as votive offerings, deliberate ritual deposits left by visitors who continued to regard the ancient mound as a sacred or spiritually significant location, even though Roman Ireland itself never existed in any administrative sense, meaning these items most likely arrived through trade or travel rather than any Roman presence on Irish soil. This pattern of continued offering and ritual visitation, spanning from the Bronze Age through the early medieval period, indicates that Newgrange's perceived sacred significance persisted across an almost unimaginable span of time, surviving the complete replacement of the population, language, religion, and material culture of the people who had originally built it. By the time Ireland's medieval Christian literary tradition began committing its rich body of mythology to writing, beginning in earnest around the 8th century AD and continuing for centuries afterward, Newgrange and the surrounding Boyne Valley monuments had become deeply woven into Irish mythological tradition, associated specifically with the Tuatha De Danann, a supernatural race of beings described in medieval Irish texts as the legendary former inhabitants of Ireland before the arrival of the Gaelic Milesians. Newgrange itself became specifically associated in this mythology with Angus Og, a god of love and youth, and with the Dagda, a major figure among the Tuatha De Danann, described in some texts as Newgrange's original builder or owner, with various medieval Irish tales describing the monument, referred to in these texts using the Irish name Brunaboyne, as a otherworldly dwelling place, a portal of sorts between the ordinary world and the realm of the Sidi, the supernatural beings of later Irish folklore. This medieval mythological framework represents, in itself, a kind of fascinating historical artifact. Not because it accurately preserves any genuine memory of Newgrange's actual Neolithic builders or their actual beliefs, separated as these medieval texts are by well over 4,000 years from the monument's construction, but because it demonstrates how thoroughly a structure's true original purpose can be lost and entirely replaced by new meaning, generation after generation, without the people doing the replacing necessarily realizing how completely disconnected their understanding had become from the monument's original context. The medieval Irish storytellers who wove Newgrange into tales of the Tuatha De Danann were not simply inventing meaning from nothing. They were continuing an unbroken, if constantly reshaped, tradition of treating this specific place as significant, sacred, otherworldly, stretching back, however transformed along the way, to whatever genuine spiritual purpose the original Neolithic builders themselves had intended. This raises a question that genuinely interests archaeologists studying long-term patterns of sacred site continuity across Europe. What was it about Newgrange specifically, beyond its undeniably impressive solstice alignment and physical scale, that allowed it to retain perceived spiritual significance across such an extraordinary, multi-millennial span of time, surviving the complete cultural replacement of Ireland's population not once, but multiple times? From Neolithic farmers through Bronze Age and Iron Age societies and into the medieval Gaelic world that finally wrote its mythology down. Some researchers point to the sheer physical impressiveness of the monument itself as sufficient explanation on its own. A structure so visually striking and architecturally sophisticated that successive cultures would naturally have continued to regard it as significant regardless of any specific continuity of belief or memory. Others suggest something less easily quantifiable may have been at work, some genuine thread of cultural transmission, however distorted and reshaped across the centuries, that allowed at least a fragment of the site's original sacred association with the winter solstice and the turning of the year to survive, in increasingly mythologized form, all the way into medieval Irish literary tradition. What remains certain is only this, that a Neolithic farming community, working without metal tools or writing, built a monument so precisely aligned to a single moment in the solar year that it still performs its function flawlessly over 5,000 years later, and that this same monument continued to draw human visitors bearing offerings across an almost incomprehensible stretch of historical time, each successive culture understanding it through its own framework, none of them, as far as the evidence suggests, possessing any genuine memory of what the original builders had actually intended. Did some authentic fragment of Newgrange's original purpose survive, however transformed, into the medieval tales of the Dagda and Angus Og, carried forward across millennia by an unbroken thread of reverence for this single place? Or does the Mound's true original purpose remain exactly as lost to us as it apparently was to the Bronze Age visitors who left their offerings, the Iron Age travelers who left theirs, and the medieval storytellers who finally gave the silent mound a name and a mythology? All of them, across thousands of years, standing before the same carved entrance stone, each filling the silence with whatever meaning their own era most needed it to hold. The layered offerings at Newgrange span millennia of continuous, if shifting, devotion. On the arid northern coast of Peru, a different ancient civilization left behind evidence of equally devoted, equally elaborate ritual practice, only for that entire civilization to collapse with a speed and severity that has left archaeologists piecing together one of South America's most genuinely unsettling ancient mysteries. The physical centerpiece of this story is the Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon, a massive adobe brick platform structure rising from the desert near modern Trujillo, Peru. Its walls covered in vivid polychrome murals depicting fanged deities, processions of warriors, and a recurring, deeply unsettling figure that archaeologists have nicknamed the Decapitator, typically shown holding a knife in one hand and a severed head in the other. This structure, built and rebuilt across multiple construction phases between roughly 100 and 700 AD, served as the ceremonial and religious heart of the Moche civilization, a sophisticated culture that flourished along Peru's northern coast without ever developing a unified centralized empire, instead organizing into a series of related but politically independent valley-based polities sharing a common religious and artistic tradition. The Moche were, by any measure, among the most technically accomplished societies in the pre-Columbian Americas. They constructed extensive irrigation canal systems that transformed the arid coastal desert into productive farmland, built monumental adobe structures including the massive Huaca del Sol, once the largest pre-Columbian structure in South America, before centuries of erosion and Spanish colonial-era looting reduced its scale, and produced extraordinarily detailed ceramic work, much of it depicting scenes of daily life, mythology, and ritual with a level of narrative detail that has given archaeologists an unusually rich window into Moche society, compared to many other ancient American cultures that left less explicit visual record behind. That visual record, alongside extensive archaeological excavation, has also revealed a religious and political system deeply organized around elaborate, ritualized human sacrifice, most dramatically confirmed through excavations at a site called Huaca de la Luna itself, where archaeologists uncovered the remains of dozens of sacrificed men, many bearing evidence of ritual violence and skeletal trauma consistent with the kind of ceremonial execution depicted in Moche art, their remains deposited in a plaza area apparently used repeatedly for this exact purpose over an extended period. Further confirmation came through the spectacular 1987 discovery of the Lord of Sipan, an elaborately furnished Moche royal tomb containing a ruler buried with extraordinary quantities of gold, silver, and ceremonial regalia, along with the remains of sacrificed attendants and animals accompanying him into the afterlife, a discovery that ranks among the most significant unlooted royal tombs ever excavated anywhere in the Americas, providing direct physical confirmation of the elite ceremonial life depicted so vividly in Moche pottery and murals. Tellingly, archaeological and isotopic analysis of the sacrificial victims found at Huaca de la Luna suggests something genuinely unusual compared to sacrificial practices documented in many other ancient societies. These individuals appear to have been, in many cases, warriors captured specifically for ritual sacrifice, possibly taken during deliberately staged or ritualized combat between rival Moche groups, rather than from entirely separate, unrelated enemy populations, suggesting a religious system in which combat and sacrifice were closely intertwined components of a shared recurring ceremonial cycle, rather than a simple matter of subjugating outside enemies. It's against this backdrop of sophisticated engineering, rich artistic tradition, and intensely ritualized religious practice that the Moche civilization's eventual collapse presents such a genuinely compelling archaeological mystery. Because unlike many ancient societal declines that unfolded gradually over centuries, the evidence at multiple Moche sites points toward disruption occurring with unusual speed, concentrated within a notably narrow window of time around the 6th century AD. The leading scientific explanation centers on a convergence of severe climatic events, supported by genuinely compelling physical evidence drawn from outside the archaeological record itself. ice cores extracted from the Cahokia ice cap in the Peruvian Andes, which preserve detailed annual climate data stretching back over 1,500 years, reveal evidence of an extraordinarily severe, prolonged drought affecting the region beginning around 562 AD and lasting, according to some interpretations of the ice core data, for as long as 3 decades, an extreme and sustained climatic disruption that would have devastated the Moche's irrigation-dependent agricultural system, which had no margin for a drought of this severity and duration built into its engineering. Compounding this crisis, geological and sedimentary evidence from the region also indicates a major El Niño event, or possibly a series of them, occurring around this same general period, bringing catastrophic flooding and heavy rainfall to a coastal desert landscape entirely unprepared for such moisture, capable of destroying irrigation infrastructure, agricultural fields, and settlements built for an arid environment within a remarkably short span of time. This combination, severe prolonged drought followed or accompanied by catastrophic flooding, represents about as extreme a 1-2 climatic blow as any ancient agricultural society could plausibly face, and archaeological evidence at multiple Moche sites does show signs consistent with exactly this kind of disruption around the right period, including evidence of significant sand encroachment burying agricultural fields and settlement areas at certain sites, consistent with major environmental upheaval to the coastal ecosystem the Moche depended upon. What complicates this otherwise compelling climatic explanation and keeps the full Moche collapse genuinely debated among specialists rather than fully settled is the considerable regional variation evident across different Moche Valley sites during this period. Rather than uniform abandonment across the entire Moche cultural sphere simultaneously, archaeological evidence suggests a more complex, varied pattern, with some sites, including areas around Huaca de la Luna itself, showing evidence of continued occupation and even significant rebuilding and reorganization following this disruptive period, while other sites and valleys appear to have been more permanently abandoned or significantly diminished. This regional variation has led many archaeologists toward an interpretation emphasizing not a single, uniform civilizational collapse, but rather a serious crisis that affected different Moche polities differently, depending on local environmental vulnerability, political resilience, and existing social tensions, ultimately reshaping rather than simply ending Moche civilization, with later Moche cultural traditions persisting in modified form at certain sites for generations after the initial 6th century climatic crisis, even as the broader, earlier Moche cultural fluorescence never fully returned to its previous scale. This is where some researchers have proposed an additional, more socially focused layer to the collapse narrative, suggesting that the severe environmental crisis of the 6th century may have placed unsustainable strain on the religious and political legitimacy of Moche elite rulers, whose authority appears to have been closely tied to their claimed ability to mediate effectively with powerful deities controlling rain, agricultural fertility, and the natural order more broadly. Exactly the kind of authority that a sustained, devastating drought followed by catastrophic flooding would have severely undermined in the eyes of ordinary Moche farmers and laborers, dependent on elite-managed irrigation systems for their survival. Some researchers have specifically pointed to apparent evidence of increased and possibly intensified ritual sacrifice activity at certain sites during this general period as potentially reflecting exactly this kind of religious and political crisis response, with Moche elites possibly escalating sacrificial practices in a desperate attempt to restore divine favor and shore up their own threatened authority amid worsening environmental catastrophe. Though this specific connection between intensified sacrifice and environmental crisis remains an interpretive hypothesis rather than a definitively proven causal relationship, given the inherent difficulty of precisely dating and sequencing ritual activity against environmental data with full certainty. What emerges from all of this evidence, taken together, is a portrait of genuine, severe, well-documented environmental catastrophe converging with a religious and political system whose own foundational claims to legitimacy may have made it particularly vulnerable to exactly this kind of crisis, producing not a single clean collapse with one identifiable cause, but a complex, regionally varied unraveling whose precise internal sequence, whose exact balance between environmental and social causation, and whose full human experience on the ground, remain genuinely difficult to fully reconstruct from archaeological and climatic evidence alone, however rich and detailed that evidence happens to be compared to many other ancient societies. Did the Moche people watch their irrigation canals run dry and then drown beneath floodwaters within the span of a single devastating generation? Their elite rulers claimed power over rain and harvest, crumbling alongside the very infrastructure that authority had been built upon. Did the apparent intensification of ritual sacrifice during this period represent a genuine, desperate religious response to catastrophe, an attempt to bargain with gods who seem to have already abandoned their bargain with the Moche people? Or does the truth lie in some more gradual, regionally fragmented unraveling that the dramatic ice core data, however compelling on its own, simplifies more than the actual lived experience of Moche communities ever truly was? Beneath the painted walls of the Huaca de la Luna, where the decapitator still watches over the desert with his knife and his severed head, the precise sequence of catastrophe, faith, and collapse that ended Moche civilization's golden centuries remains buried as deeply as the sacrificed warriors whose bones first revealed to modern archaeologists just how high the stakes of that ancient bargain with the gods had truly been. The Moche left their answers buried in bone and painted plaster. The final stop on this leg of our journey lies beneath open water, a sunken city off the southern coast of Greece, visible only to swimmers, that managed to remain effectively unknown to the modern world for thousands of years, despite never being more than a few meters beneath the surface the entire time. Pavlopetri rests in the shallow waters of Vatica Bay, off the southern Laconian coast of the Peloponnese, its ruins lying at a depth of only about 3 to 4 meters, close enough to the surface that the geometric outlines of its streets, building foundations, and courtyards remain visible from above on a calm day. A layout of an entire ancient town spread across the sandy seabed like a map drawn directly onto the ocean floor. Formally identified and surveyed in 1967 by British oceanographer Nicholas Fleming, Pavlopetri is now recognized as one of the oldest submerged towns yet discovered anywhere in the world, with evidence of occupation stretching back to at least 3500 BC, and a clearly organized urban layout, including building foundations, courtyards, streets, and what appear to be religious and ceremonial structures dating to the Mycenaean Bronze Age, sometime between roughly 1680 and 1180 BC, the same general era that produced the Mycenaean palace civilization later mythologized in Homer's epics. The mainstream scientific explanation for Pavlopetri's submersion centers on well-documented seismic activity in this geologically unstable region of the Mediterranean, where the gradual subsidence of coastal land, likely compounded by one or more significant earthquake events, combined with broader sea level changes following the end of the last ice age, eventually pulled the ancient settlement beneath the waterline sometime around 1000 BC, placing the town's submergence at the tail end of the Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread upheaval, destruction, and societal disruption affecting numerous civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously, including the Mycenaean palace centers themselves. What makes Pavlopetri's particular case scientifically significant, beyond its sheer age, is the unusually complete and legible nature of its submerged urban plan. Unlike many other coastal settlements affected by sea level change, where structures have either eroded into unrecognizable rubble or been buried beneath centuries of accumulated sediment, Pavlopetri's relatively shallow, sheltered position within Vatica Bay appears to have preserved its street grid and building outlines with remarkable clarity, giving archaeologists an unusually direct window into Bronze Age urban planning, complete with evidence suggesting organized residential districts and what may have been dedicated public or religious spaces, all laid out according to a coherent town plan that predates many of the more famous, better-known examples of organized ancient Mediterranean urbanism. Here is where the genuine historical puzzle begins, and where caution becomes particularly important in separating well-supported archaeological fact from looser, more speculative cultural association. Pavlopetri itself, by its modern name and as a formally identified mapped archaeological site, was entirely unknown to scholarship until Fleming's 1967 survey. No medieval text refers to Pavlopetri by name, because that name is itself a modern Greek label, loosely translating to something like Paul's Stone, applied to the site only in relatively recent local usage before its formal archaeological identification. Any claim of medieval sources directly and specifically describing this particular sunken settlement by name or with unambiguous confirmable geographic precision would overstate what the historical record actually supports. What does have a genuine basis in the broader regional and literary tradition is something somewhat different and considerably more diffuse. A long-standing, well-documented pattern of Greek folklore and local maritime tradition describing sunken cities and submerged ruins along various stretches of the Greek coastline, a tradition with roots stretching back through antiquity and persisting in various local forms throughout the medieval and even modern periods, generally tied to the simple, visible fact that ancient stone ruins genuinely are visible beneath shallow coastal waters in numerous locations across Greece, a geologically active region where coastal subsidence and earthquake-driven submersion have demonstrably affected multiple ancient settlements over the centuries, not Pavlopetri alone. Local fishing communities along the Laconian coast, including those near Vatica Bay specifically, are generally understood by researchers to have possessed long-standing informal awareness of submerged stone structures visible in the shallow water near Pavlopetri, well before Fleming's formal scientific survey, a pattern of local, undocumented knowledge preceding official archaeological discovery. That is, in fact, fairly common across underwater archaeology more broadly, where local communities frequently know of submerged ruins long before any researcher arrives to formally study and publish findings about them. This broader regional tradition of submerged ruins and sunken settlements along the Greek coastline also intersects, in a more literary and considerably less geographically precise way, with the deep tradition in Greek mythology and literature of cities and lands lost beneath the sea, most famously expressed in Plato's account of Atlantis, written in the 4th century BC, centuries before any medieval source we might consider, but itself part of a long Greek cultural fascination with the idea of submerged, vanished civilizations that continued to resonate through later Byzantine and medieval Greek literary and folk tradition in various, generally vaguer and less specifically located forms. A recurring cultural motif rather than a precise historical record pointing toward any single identifiable site. There is also a more specific and considerably better grounded literary connection worth noting, rooted not in vague medieval legend, but in the Bronze Age textual tradition itself. Homer's Iliad, in its detailed catalog of ships listing the various Greek contingents that sailed to Troy, mentions a settlement called Helos among the towns of Laconia, contributing forces to the Trojan War effort, a place whose exact location has never been definitively confirmed by archaeologists, leading some researchers and historians over the years to propose Pavlopetri as a plausible candidate for this Homeric Helos, given its location, its confirmed Mycenaean-era occupation, and its eventual disappearance beneath the waves at a date not impossibly distant from the broader period traditionally associated with the Trojan War narrative itself. This remains a genuinely speculative identification rather than a confirmed archaeological conclusion, given the considerable difficulty of definitively matching any specific submerged or land-based Bronze Age site to a place named only briefly within an epic poem composed centuries after the events it describes, itself drawing on a long oral tradition whose own relationship to genuine Bronze Age geography remains, like so much of Homeric scholarship, a matter of ongoing and likely permanently unresolved academic debate. What we're left with, then, is a town that was extraordinarily real, urbanistically sophisticated, and genuinely ancient, submerged by entirely natural and scientifically well-understood seismic and sea-level processes around the end of the Bronze Age, surviving in a state of remarkable underwater preservation for roughly 3,000 years before modern science finally identified and mapped it in 1967. Surrounded, in the centuries before that formal discovery, not by any precise, confirmable medieval written record naming this site specifically, but by the broader, genuinely old Greek cultural and folk tradition of coastal communities living alongside and telling stories about the visible, tangible ruins of vanished settlements resting just beneath the water at their feet, a tradition stretching from ancient literary epic through Byzantine folklore and into the living memory of the very Laconian fishermen whose informal knowledge of Pavlopetri stones likely predated by generations, the moment any outside researcher finally arrived to give the ruins a name, a date, and a place in the formal historical record at last. Was Pavlopetri truly the Homeric Helos, its name preserved across more than 2,500 years of oral epic tradition before finally being matched, tentatively and still unproven, to the correct patch of submerged seafloor? Did the fishing families of Vatica Bay, across countless generations stretching back through the medieval period and beyond, quietly pass down knowledge of those ghostly stone outlines beneath the waves, their own informal oral tradition functioning as a kind of unofficial historical record that simply never found its way into any text scholars would later study? Or is the true story simpler, and in its own way just as striking? An entire Bronze Age town, complete with streets, courtyards, and the everyday lives of thousands of people, sinking quietly beneath the Mediterranean and waiting, in plain sight just below the surface, for nearly 3 millennia, until someone finally thought to look down.